Chapter 467. I'm going to faint. Sorry. Halfway through writing, I unknowingly fell asleep on the table. When I woke up, it was already 5 in the morning. My saliva was dripping onto the keyboard. Sweat. Hurry up and finish writing this chapter. It's now 6:30 in the morning. Sigh, it's even later now. I've kept everyone waiting. GOR Chapter 433 Escape from Cage, Part 6. After giving the order to retreat, Manninger was no longer able to hold on. His mind was greatly damaged. Just a moment ago, he was still in high spirits, thinking that he could defeat the enemy on that very day. However, in the next moment, he received bad news. Such a sudden change from great joy to great sorrow was always the most hurtful. Although Manninger was a hero of his generation, he was still quite old after all. Encountering such a sudden change, he was unable to withstand it. After giving the order, he no longer had the energy to speak. He could only order his men to disperse the battalion leaders in the tent. With the commander like this, his subordinates were naturally at a loss. However, although Manninger vomited blood and almost fainted, he was not muddle-headed. He only gave the order, but did not give any explanation. He only used the prestige of a leader to suppress them. Although his subordinates had doubts about his order, they did not dare to disobey. Everything had its pros and cons. The military system of the Ottoman Empire was crude and loose. It was not as well organized and clear-cut as the Byzantine army. However, the Ottoman Empire's army had always been subordinate to the various tribes. In addition to being the commander of the army also had the identity of the patriarch of the tribe. With these two identities, his prestige and power were much greater than that of a general of the Byzantine army. As the commander of the Ottoman army, no matter how absurd the order was, his subordinates would not dare to disobey. When the order to retreat was given, the various battalions began to move. However, this was a retreat of tens of thousands of soldiers after all. How could they move just because they wanted to? Moreover, there were many Ottoman army forces surrounding Green. When Manninger gave the order to assemble the entire army, the meaning was very clear. Not only was his main elite force retreating, even the surrounding troops responsible for encircling the enemy were to assemble and withdraw. Tens of thousands of soldiers setting off was not something that could be done just because of a few words. He sent the cavalry out of the camp to inform the other troops to gather. He also ordered the soldiers of the various battalions to pack up and set off. One thing after another, it could be said that a slight move in one part would affect the whole situation. However, Manninger continued to give orders, and his orders were filled with impatience and urgency. He even gave the order that the entire army could abandon the heavy and difficult-to-carry supplies and gather light. Even the extra food stored in the army could be abandoned. All troops bring 6 days' worth of rations. The reindeer cavalry will lead the way, and the main infantry will follow behind. After resting for half a day, Manninger finally regained some of his energy. He gave a series of orders: leave 5,000 men here to cover the rear. The army gathered and set out, and the chaos delayed the whole day. During this time, it was said that Manninger vomited blood twice and fainted once. Finally, on the afternoon of the second day, the entire army was ready to set off and withdraw. The Ottoman reindeer cavalry that had been sent out to patrol the flanks of Green's troops were also recalled. The troops blocking Green's back also set off. Under Manninger's orders, they did not even bother with the camp. The entire army only brought weapons and equipment as they circled around Green's camp and entered Manninger's main camp. Even after all the preparations were completed, Manninger did not announce the real news to the public. So much so that before he fainted, the first thing he did was to have his trusted personal guards by his side kill all the scattered soldiers who came back from the new city to report the news. These pitiful fellows were originally the elite soldiers of the Bashak tribe. They had fled from the new city and were defeated along the way. They had almost risked their lives to rush back to report the news. In this world of ice and snow, the roads were difficult to travel on. Some of them were even carrying weapons, so a few of them died on the road. There were also a few who fell behind because their mounts were exhausted. There were no more than 30 of them who were able to make it back to Manninger's main camp alive to report the news, but they were all killed by Manninger's order. It wasn't that Manninger was ruthless, but he understood that at this critical moment, the news of his base being raided could not be spread out in the army. The entire army was gathered here, but their base was lost. More importantly, there were tens of thousands of soldiers here. Every day, the men and horses would eat and drink. Just the consumption of food alone was a huge figure. When the army went on a campaign, although the army carried some food, most of it was transported from the rear. Originally, this was the responsibility of his son, Morka, who was in charge of the new city. But now that the base was lost, the direct consequence was that his army of tens of thousands would immediately have no follow-up supplies. Relying on the food stored in the army would not be able to support it for a long time. Once the news of the base being lost spread out, the morale of the army would immediately become unstable. At this time, there was still a Byzantine army of nearly 20,000 soldiers in front of him. If the enemy took advantage of the situation and made any mistakes, he, Manninger, would really be unable to cry even if he wanted to. At this time, even if there was only 1 in 10,000 chance of danger, he did not dare to take it. He had to turn back the army. Manninger's current mood was naturally extremely sorrowful. Morka was his son, and the eldest son that he had spent the most effort to cultivate. After grooming him for so many years, he had watched his eldest son grow up to be an adult. Finally, he was able to follow him into battle and share his burdens. He had even deliberately groomed him and helped him establish his prestige. He was secretly his future successor. But now, his son was actually killed outside the city in what he thought was the safest base in the rear. The base was also lost. What was worse was that the new city stored most of the resources that Manninger had plundered and seized after occupying Ilton Prefecture and the Corsica military district. Food, money, armaments. Manninger had gathered all these things in the new city. He had hoped to turn the new city into a base for his Bashark tribe to take root in this land in the future. The money, food, and supplies were all prepared for the mass migration of his tribe after spring. But now it was all lost. Since the expedition to the south, almost all the spoils of war and loot were stored in the new city. Before winter, in order to survive the winter, Manninger had ordered that all the food in the county be gathered in the new city. Therefore, no matter how one looked at it, the new city could not be lost. It absolutely could not be lost. All of Manninger's plans, calculations, and ambitions in the future were all based on this foundation. Most importantly, now that the new city had been occupied, without the reserves stored in the new city, his army of tens of thousands would not even have food to survive the winter. Yes, Ilton Prefecture and Corsica Prefecture were both very big. However, Odin's people were not good at farming and production. They had been entrenched here for more than half a year and had turned the two territories into a mess. At this moment, even if Manninger wanted to give up on the new city and take his army to other places for food, almost all the food in the vast Ilton Prefecture had been plundered. Only a small amount of food was left in a few places, enough to satisfy a small garrison. Where else could provide food for tens of thousands of troops? Therefore, he had to go back. He had to take back the new city. Otherwise, in this cold winter, his tens of thousands of Odin's men would have to rely on the northwest wind to survive. Not to mention fighting a war in another 10 days or half a month, they would probably starve to death. In terms of heartache, the heartache in this aspect was even greater than the grief of losing his son. For Manninger, it was a race against time. Every moment he delayed would increase the danger to the new city. Although he did not know which of the Byzantine army troops had ambushed his base, and which general was leading the troops, he had been through many years of experience. He was certain that the person who dared to take such a huge risk and infiltrate the enemy's territory with a small force to ambush the enemy's base must be extremely courageous. After all, this person was the kind of madman who did not adhere to common sense. He was not afraid of anything else. He was only afraid that the enemy general who had ambushed his base would go crazy and set fire to the place. In that case, devouring Green's troops would be secondary. While Manninger was in a hurry, Shaya was also racing against time. Shaya's 800 cavalrymen had fought many battles along the way south. No matter how strong these transformed cavalrymen were, and no matter how miraculous the muscle fruits left behind by the ancient gnomes were, no matter how strong the men and horses were, they were still made of flesh and blood. After a few battles, there were naturally people who were injured and people who died in battle. This elite force of 800 cavalrymen was finally reduced in numbers. After Shaya took over the new city, the cavalrymen by his side, including those who were not seriously injured and could still continue fighting, were only around 700 cavalrymen. There were also more than 10 seriously injured cavalrymen who could only be temporarily placed in Manninger's residence in the new city to recuperate. Fortunately, Shaya had more time than Manninger. He calculated in his heart that even if the defeated soldiers who had left the city could run to Manninger's camp at the front line to report, and then wait for Manninger's army to return. No matter how anxious Manninger was, no matter how hard he ran, and even if Manninger sent the most mobile cavalrymen to return first, in this cold and icy weather, even if they were all cavalrymen, they would definitely not be able to return in 3 days. When he entered the city, he disposed of the Odin captives. All the severed legs were thrown outside the city gate. After freezing for a night, when he sent people out to check the next day, there was no sign of life. Shaya was still unwilling to stop. He even ordered people to collect the corpses of hundreds of Odin's soldiers and hung them on the city wall with ropes. In the middle of the row of corpses hanging on the city wall, there was a set of armor. This armor belonged to Morka. It was a pity that the son of the Scarlet Snow Army's commander, the future successor of the Bashak's patriarch, died in the hands of Shaya. In the final blow that Shaya smashed the city gate, even the corpse was directly smashed into pieces. Not even a complete outline could be recovered. Only some broken armor was left, which was also hung on the city gate by Shaya's order. After the city gate was full of Odin's corpses, Shaya began the next move. He first gathered all the surrendered and affiliated troops in the city. Most of these affiliated troops were surrendered troops from the Corsica military district, and there were also a small number of local garrison troops from the former Ilton military district. There were about 2,500 soldiers in the city. When Shaya's cavalry entered the city, they annihilated more than 1,000 Odin's garrison troops, killed Morka on the spot, and smashed the city gate. How could these surrendered troops have the courage to resist? Shaya ordered all the surrendered troops to gather and then began to lecture them. He was pressed for time and did not have so many conciliatory means. He could only slowly pacify the people. The bloody way he dealt with the Odin's tomahawk had already frightened these people. Now that he gathered the entire army to lecture them, many people were uneasy. They were afraid that this ruthless Byzantium general would also like to slaughter prisoners of war. More than 1,500 Scarlet Snow Army elites were easily annihilated. Although there were more of them, their combat power was a few levels lower than the 1,500 Scarlet Snow Army elite. If the person in front of them really wanted to raise his butcher's knife, how could they resist? Just when everyone was feeling fearful, Shaya reprimanded. The cold north wind was still blowing, but Shaya did not even put on his armor. He held his flaming fork in his hand and strode to a big rock that was temporarily moved in front of him. He deliberately paused for a moment so that every soldier in the surrendered troops in front of him could see his figure clearly. When he broke into the city yesterday, killed Morka, and smashed the city gate, his figure was already seen by many people. Now that he was standing in front of them, who would not recognize this fierce man? Who could forget his godlike majesty yesterday? Shea's face was cold. After a moment of silence, he finally spoke. His tone of lecture was the same as his eyes at this moment. They were sharp, awe-inspiring, and sharp. I know that you are scared to death now. If I want to kill you, it will only take a moment. I don't care about the life and death of you people at all. To kill or not to kill, it's only up to me. Good Lord, he did not have the slightest intention of being soft. He came up with such an imposing manner to forcefully suppress people. However, his strong divine power yesterday was still vivid in their minds. At this moment, when these rude and overbearing words were spoken, it seemed so natural. However, I won't kill you. Lao Tzu will be merciful and spare your lives. It's not because I'm merciful. I don't know how to be merciful. I won't kill you because you are still useful to me. I won't avoid telling you this. So I'll spare your lives. You don't have to be grateful to me. After a pause, Shea snorted heavily. His cold voice carried a hint of cruelty as it resounded throughout the whole place. Next, you will work for me and work hard for me. I know that there must be some among you who have the idea of getting lucky. Now that you are afraid of me, surrender to me, and pledge your allegiance to me. Some of you may think that Manninger will definitely come back with his army when he hears the news. He has tens of thousands of troops. At that time, this city will still have a different master. You people have surrendered once or twice and gradually get used to it. At worst, you will surrender again. Ha! I'm afraid that there are many among you who have such thoughts. Lao Tzu knows this very well in his heart, so I won't beat around the bush with you. When these words were spoken, many of the 2,000 surrendered soldiers' expressions changed. Although Shea's cavalry was ridiculously strong, their numbers were still too few. Moreover, the strength of Odin's people was deeply ingrained in their hearts. These few hundred cavalry soldiers were able to raid Manninger's lair because of their strength. The other 70% was luck and trickery. Once Manninger's army returned, it was impossible to defend the new city with just a few hundred cavalry soldiers. At that time, at worst, they would surrender again. There were indeed many who had such thoughts. These were all people who had surrendered. Once their bones softened, it would be very difficult to harden them again. But I want to tell you right now, you should get rid of these thoughts as soon as possible, because you won't have another chance to surrender. Not even a little bit. It's not that I don't want to give you a chance to surrender. It's that Manninger won't give you another chance to surrender. Shea's face was full of malevolence as he shouted fiercely, "You all saw those corpses on the city walls. The Odin's people in the new city were all Manninger's closest relatives and elites. Now, most of them were slaughtered by Lao Tzu. Even Manninger's own son was slaughtered by Lao Tzu. He lost more than 1,000 elites, and even his own son was killed. Manninger's heart must be burning with rage. You are not idiot. Just think about it. Even if Manninger comes back and comes to the city walls and sees the corpses hanging on the city walls, how much rage will burn in his heart? Seeing his son's armor hanging on the city walls without a complete corpse, he will fly into a rage and vomit blood. Ha 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 ha!" At this point, Shea's eyes were vicious as he slowly swept his gaze over everyone present. At this moment, his gaze was as sharp as a sword. Anyone who was swept by his gaze was shocked by his gaze and didn't dare to look him in the eye. Then, they heard Shea's vicious voice ringing in their ears. "Think about it again. When the time comes, Manningo will find out that when the city was breached, more than 1,000 of his elite subordinates were slaughtered by me, and his own son was slaughtered by me, while you 2,000+ people just stood there and watched, not moving at all. You didn't even dare to let out a fart before obediently surrendering to me. Ha 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 ha. When Manninger finds out about this, will he still spare you? Will he accept your surrender once again? As long as you aren't idiots, think about it in your hearts. Manninger's monstrous rage will be poured out on you. So, if there are any fellows who are half-heartedly thinking about joining Odin's people in the future, you better give up on that thought as soon as possible. You guys, if you fall into Manninger's hands with Odin's personality, I'm afraid he won't even give you a chance to defend yourselves. He'll just order for all of you to be buried alive. Everyone's expressions changed. They raised their heads and looked at Shea with eyes full of fear and terror. So, what I want to tell you now is that you have no other choice. All the paths had already been taken. Right now, the only path of survival in front of you is to choose me. You can only choose to follow me. Other than that, everything else is a dead end, a dead end. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 468. GOR Chapter 433 Breaking Out of the Cage, Part 7. As Shea was giving a lecture to the surrendered soldiers, Nene was watching from the side. Nene watched as Shea put on an overbearing and ferocious look. He did not try to beat around the bush at all as he forced his way through. In the eyes of the experienced politicians, this method of subduing the hearts of the people was crude to the extreme. It was not even worth mentioning. But the strange thing was, the effect of these words shocked everyone. Shea's actions had convinced the surrendered soldiers. It was for no other reason than the fact that they had all listened to Shea's words. Those seemingly crude, barbaric and overbearing words were, in fact, a fact that they had no choice but to admit. From the very beginning, Shea had put on a Lao Tzu did not kill you all because you all still have value. Thus, there is no need to thank Lao Tzu attitude. Although it was a vicious and overbearing statement, it was also a frank one. At the very least, it gave them the impression that even though this man was arrogant to the extreme, he was telling the truth. Next up, Chern Xiaoyan's words came out one by one, causing the faces of all of them to change. Other than that, there was no other way out. There was no longer any possibility of surrendering to Odin's men. Shea's words were all correct. Every one of the surrendered soldiers thought to themselves, if I were Manninger and I knew that my son had been killed, my subordinates had been slaughtered and my lair had been raided, yet the surrendered soldiers had surrendered so easily. If I were Manninger I would never forgive them. Besides, Odin's men had always been savage and overbearing. They would kill without batting an eyelid. They had always treated the surrendered soldiers with abuse and beatings. Killing captives was a common occurrence for Odin's men. After saying that, Shea did not appear to be worried at all. He simply stood on the rock and quietly observed the surrendered soldiers below, waiting for their reaction. Finally, panic, fear, and various other expressions flashed across the faces of the surrendered soldiers. Then, a soft clamor broke out below. Some even began sobbing, some began whispering to one another. There were even some who appeared to be officers who revealed confused and hesitant expressions. Shea did not stop them. Instead, he allowed them to do as they pleased. He waited patiently for a moment. Then, he suddenly took a deep breath and spoke with a thunderous voice. What do you think? Do you want to live or die? Make your choice. The loud roar caused everyone's bodies to tremble. Many of them raised their heads to look at Shea. Gradually their eyes. Of course. But if we follow you, what can we do? Can you guarantee that we will live? Lao Tzu cannot. Shea sneered. Live. You are all King scared silly. Look at the skin on your body. You are soldiers. Warriors. All you think about is how to live. Have you forgotten your duty? If you really want to live, just take off your skin. The city gates are open. Go out and find a way to live. Lao Tzu will not stop you. These words were a little unreasonable. Leave the city? Given the current situation, anyone who did not want to leave the city would be a son of AB*TCH, who here did not know that the new city was Manninger's lair. He would definitely bring Odin's army back. When that time comes, there would be a bloody battle here. Who did not want to take advantage of the fact that Odin's men had yet to come back and escape the city? But the problem was, would they be able to escape? The surrounding villages and towns within a radius of 100 li had all been tormented by Odin's men to the point that there were no signs of life. In a world of ice and snow, without food and horses, leaving the city like this was truly courting death. I said before, I will keep you alive, because you are still useful. Lao Tzu is not merciful, but Lao Tzu will not lie to you. As long as you show that you are still useful, Lao Tzu will keep you alive to work for me. Think about it carefully. Follow me and work hard to find a way to live. It is a 9 out of 10 chance of dying. But if you fall into Manninger's hands, you will die without a doubt. After saying this, Shea deliberately sneered a few times and shouted loudly. I see that many of you were originally elites of the Corsica military. Humph, but I did not expect that after surrendering to Odin's men, your bones would become so soft. You don't even have the courage to struggle to live. Gutless. Gutless. Every single one of you is gutless. I only have one sentence. Do you dare to fight with Lao Tzu? Repeatedly hammering, presenting facts, and finally using words to provoke them, finally, many of their faces gradually showed signs of life. The officer who spoke first could not help but shout. Sir, we are not gutless. We will fight with you. That's right. We will fight with you. Struggle to find a way to live. As long as Sir keeps his promise and does not harm us, we will fight with you. Seeing that Shea had finally found some signs of life in the surrendered soldiers, who were originally fearful and numb, their gazes towards Shea were finally filled with admiration. With the allegiance of these 2,000+ surrendered troops, moreover, they were sincere in their allegiance, and not the kind of situation where they were outwardly obeying but secretly harboring ulterior motives. After all, the next battle was related to the life and death of Shea's small group. If he kept 2,000 fellows who could harbor ulterior motives by his side at any time, he might as well ruthlessly slaughter them early on. Shea did not have any other secret to subduing these 2,500 people. There was only one word to describe it: force. He believed in a saying, even a rabbit bites when cornered. What more humans? Even the most cowardly and spineless person would dare to fight with their lives on the line when they were forced into a desperate situation. Shea then began to mobilize the 2,000 men to set up the city's defenses. The new city had been under Manninger's control for more than half a year. Naturally, there was no shortage of supplies. The food gathered in the city was piled up like a mountain, enough to last 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers through the winter. As for the other military equipment, weapons, bows and arrows, they were piled up in the warehouses. There was no need to worry about the city's defenses. The new city had not experienced much fighting. The 7th Division of Ilton County was wiped out in a field battle. After the 7th Division was wiped out, Ilton County had basically surrendered. When Manninger took over the new city, he did so without shedding a single drop of blood. The city's defenses did not suffer much damage. In fact, during the past half a year, Manninger had even made a number of fortifications. The city gate, which had been smashed by Shea, was also replaced with a new door panel. A huge round log was selected from the city's storehouse, and the city gate was almost completely sealed. If this was a normal defensive battle, sealing up the city gate would be the worst thing to do. It would be the same as blocking off their escape route. However, this was Shea's order and the surrendered soldiers had to carry it out. After all, none of them were fools. If Odin's men really besieged the city, the surrendered soldiers would not be able to run far in this world of ice and snow. Even if they did manage to escape, they would freeze or starve to death. Thus, since they had made up their minds to fight for a way out, they had decided to defend the city to the death. If the city gate was sealed, then so be it. After spending nearly 2 days rearranging the city's defenses, Shea called Nei over. "You want to leave the city?" When Nei heard Shea's words, his face changed. He frowned and said, "That's too dangerous." Shea said calmly, "Our men are cavalry. Staying in the city to fight a war of attrition is too much of a waste. Only in a field battle can we fully display our combat strength. I will lead the cavalry out of the city and lie in ambush. When Manninger's army besieges the city, I will take them by surprise and kill them. Only then will we be able to take a bite out of them." Nei's face was filled with worry. "Why don't you stay in the city and I will lead the cavalry out of the city?" Shea laughed and looked at Nei. Then, he slowly said, "I know you have good intentions. However, do you think it will be easy to stay in the city? Although these 2,000 people have been subdued by me, they don't have any loyalty to us at all. They are just struggling to survive, that's why they are working with us. They are afraid that if they fall into the hands of Odin, they will also die, so they will fight with us. Therefore, you stay in the city. In addition to commanding the defense of the city, you are also responsible for carefully deterring these guys and not letting them cause trouble. I will take most of the people with me. I can only leave you with some injured cavalry and some guards. At most, I can only leave you with 50 people. To deter the surrendered troops in the city, such a heavy burden will depend on you." When he said this, Nei was finally speechless. Shea immediately gathered all the cavalrymen under his command. In addition to some injured ones, he also left some guards inside, making a total of 50 cavalrymen. He brought the rest with him, replenishing the provisions and fodder. Each cavalryman was equipped with 3 horses, and he also brought 3 times the number of grain bags. Only then did he lead more than 600 cavalrymen out of the city. Just before leaving the city, Shea whispered in Nei's ear for a moment. After listening to Shea's words, Nei's eyes suddenly flashed with a strange light. He could not help but sigh. "This plan of yours is really vicious." After Shea led the 600 riders out of the city, they bypassed the city defense and stopped in the wilderness. Looking at the sky, Shea turned around and laughed loudly at the 600 majestic elite cavalrymen behind him. "We are cavalrymen. If we were to stand on the city walls and defend the city, I'm afraid that not only would I be suffocated to death, but you would also be suffocated. So it is better to come out and fight in the wilderness." With that, he pointed to a direction in front and laughed loudly. "I originally wanted to take you to find a place to hide and wait for Manninger's army to surround the city. Then I will come out and kill him by surprise. But now I have changed my mind. Since we are going to do it, we might as well do it big. I only ask you, do you have the guts to do a life-risking business with me?" These 600 cavalry were the best of the best. How could they not dare? What's more, following a commander like Shea all the way to the south, they killed to their heart's content. After successive victories, everyone was full of spirit. Here, there was also a thought that could not be put on the table. These cavalrymen were the cream of the crop. Most of them were hand-picked from the roadrear cavalrymen. Only a small number of them were originally Nene's mounted bandit. Previously, Shea had handed this cavalry unit over to Nene to command. Although Nene was also a heroine with outstanding martial prowess, she was after all a woman. These elites of Roadrear's cavalry, which one of them wasn't arrogant and full of arrogance. Although Nei's bravery was admirable and Nei was also the cavalry commander appointed by Shea, but for these former Roadrear cavalry to listen to the orders of a woman every day, it was inevitable for any man to have some doubts. This point had nothing to do with Nei's ability. It was purely a result of the status of men and women. Therefore, even though the cavalry under Nene's command was elite, they could still fight. However, they always lacked a sense of heroism. But now it was different. Shea was the commander and he was also a member of the Rodrier cavalry. He was also once General Adric's personal guard. He had fought alongside these men, shed blood together, made great contributions and was also known for his martial prowess. The most important thing was that Shea was a man. Moreover, during the siege of the new city, this commander who had a sickly appearance suddenly erupted with unparalleled divine might. All of these were simply in line with the standard of a perfect commander that every cavalryman dreamed of. After following Shea out of the city, the hearts of these cavalrymen were filled with excitement. Compared to Ney's subordinates, they were even more excited. At this moment, not to mention Shea saying that he was going to take some risks, even if Shea said that he was going to lead them directly to the Odin Empire's Odin Divine City, these hundreds of elite men wouldn't even frown. Seeing that everyone was rubbing their hands together, Shea laughed and shouted, "I'm sure that Manninger is burning with impatience. He's worried about the new city and will definitely have his cavalrymen form the vanguard. The cavalrymen are very fast, so they must have left the infantry and rushed here first. I've counted the days and it's almost time. The enemy's cavalrymen won't be too many, but they won't be too few either. After some calculations there should be more than 3,000 of them. I only have one idea. We will directly head north along the main road and meet their vanguard cavalrymen. Then we will crush them. There is naturally a huge risk in this. Firstly, the vanguard cavalrymen will definitely be the most elite cavalrymen in Manninger's army. Their numbers are several times more than ours, maybe even 10 times more. With just 600 of us, we have to deal with thousands of cavalrymen. Everyone's heads are tied to their waistbands. Secondly, I can't be sure how far their vanguard cavalrymen are from the main army. If we defeat their cavalrymen and their main army catches up to us and encircles us, with just our numbers, no matter how good we are at fighting, we will be trapped to death." Shea deliberately used an arrogant tone and said coldly, "Are you afraid or not? With such elite troops, who would say the word afraid?" Just as Shea finished speaking, a cavalryman shouted, "Sir, we are heroes from Rodrier. When have we ever had the word afraid in our heads?" "Yes, sir, bring us forward. Forward!" "The Rodrier cavalrymen can only advance." "Ha ha ha! What do you mean by tying our heads to your waistbands?" "Sir, since we have killed our way to the new city, our heads should have long been tied to our waistbands." Shea saw that the crowd was in high spirits and deliberately laughed heroically. Then, his eyes emitted a sharp light. "Good. All troops, line up and follow me north. First, we will cut off one of Manninger's claws and destroy his vanguard cavalrymen. Let their entire army be terrified before they even reach the new city. Today is the Lantern Festival, so it's a bit less. 4,000 words. I wish everyone a happy Lantern Festival and a family reunion. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 469. GOR Chapter 433 Breaking Out of the Cage, Part 8. The moment Manninger's army was mobilized, Green's keen senses picked up on something. After all, he was a veteran general of the army. Although he had been shelved for many years, this mad dog's keen sense of smell had not faded much. When Manninger sent out his cavalry and the Odin's army surrounding Green began to move, some of the generals in the army were deeply worried. They were worried that this was a signal that Manninger was finally about to launch an all-out attack. But after Green looked into the distance for half a day from the high platform of the army camp, he suddenly began to laugh crazily. The haze that had gathered on this mad dog's face for the past few days was swept away. What replaced it was excitement, and a trace of sharpness. Sure enough, the Odin's army began to move. They gathered towards Manninger's camp. The large net that had surrounded Green was removed by Manninger himself. The next day, before the sky had even darkened, someone ran over with an excited face to report to Green. Odin's army had retreated. This news caused all the generals in the army to be overjoyed. But when Green heard it, he only smiled faintly. His expression was very calm. He did not panic. Instead, he carefully asked the reporting soldier. When he learned that Odin's army had left behind several thousand men to cover the retreat, Green's eyes lit up. The ones left behind to cover the retreat, were they infantry or cavalry? Infantry troops, the reporting soldier calmly replied. When Green heard this, he slapped Wu Rant's table and jumped up. The old mad dog's face was full of joy. He laughed loudly several times, and a trace of killing intent and malevolence appeared on his face. Good, good, good! Manninger has finally made his move. Ha 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 ha! One of the generals saw this general suddenly go crazy and carefully probed. Sir, since Odin's army has retreated, we should also retreat. The army's food reserves are running low. It just so happens that the several thousand men left behind by Odin's army are all infantry. This is a great fortune. If the cavalry were left behind, we would have to worry about them chasing after us. But now we don't have to worry about that. When Green heard this, his eyes suddenly widened. Looking at the people below, he suddenly shouted, "Retreat? What a joke!" Lao Tzu had been holding back for so many days, swallowing his anger and fear, all for this day. This is a great opportunity for our army to make a contribution. You want me to retreat? Ha 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 ha! Sharba! After his last cry, a majestic man, a powerful man, the general of cavalry, commander of Shaya's cavalry, General Sharba. As Shaya's trusted aide and good brother, who had gone through life and death together with him, Shaya handed over his cavalry regiment to Sharba to lead. The remnants of the original Roadrear cavalry, as well as the mounted bandits under his command, formed an independent cavalry regiment of several thousand men. All of this was given to Sharba. This brave, straightforward, and forthright man was indeed worthy of being a hero of the Roadrear cavalry. When the generals in the tent heard that Meningo was withdrawing, they all had the thought of retreating. Instead, Sharba was rubbing his fists and rubbing his palms together. He had an eager look on his face. When he heard Grim's call, he immediately walked out and saluted. In Shaya's army, cavalry was in the minority. He only had several thousand men. It was impossible for him to raise a pure cavalry regiment like the Roadrear cavalry regiment. An independent cavalry regiment of several thousand men could be considered a luxurious arrangement. However, Shaya attached great importance to cavalry. In order to show the status of cavalry, Sharba, who only commanded 4,000 men, was actually given the rank of general. In terms of military rank, he was already on the same level as the commander of a regiment. Even Green, who was the commander of a regiment, was only at the rank of general. At this moment Sharba walked out. With his military rank, he actually didn't need to salute Green. However, Green was a veteran general of the army. Sharba still paid attention to showing respect to this mad dog. Looking at Sharba, Green's expression immediately became serious. 5,000 Odin men. If it were a field battle, would your cavalry be able to handle them? Sharba's eyes immediately erupted with a fiery light. However, he took a deep breath. He wasn't impatient. Instead, he suppressed the fire in his heart and said steadily, "If the enemy were cavalry, I would be worried that they wouldn't be able to beat us and would flee. We are all cavalry, so it's inevitable that there will be some accidents when pursuing. But if the enemy is infantry, my cavalry regiment will take care of several thousand infantry." Hearing this, Green nodded in satisfaction. However, he gave Sharba a deep look. In his memory, this man was loyal and devoted to Shaya. He did indeed have the ability to lead cavalry, but his temper was a bit rash and impatient. However, now it seemed that he had been honed. The few words he said just now were neither anxious nor impatient. He had quite the bearing of a true general. Green then laughed coldly. Good. Let's move when it's dark. First, we'll take care of the army that Manninger left behind to bring up the rear. Then, the army will move out, we'll continue south. Chase after Manninger. Sharba, your cavalry regiment will take care of the army that brought up the rear and immediately go south. I want you to bite down on Manninger's army. Fight as you go, pay attention to propriety. Don't get surrounded by them. Fight and run, I don't want you to fight to the death. I just want you to do your best to delay the speed at which they move south. My army will naturally slowly follow behind and be your shield. Manninger had indeed made a foolish move. Leaving the army for war, there were two armies that had to be led by elites. The first was the vanguard. It was the sharp blade of the vanguard. Moving ahead of the main force, it had to be led by elite. If there was an enemy blocking it, it had to be able to clear the path for the main force. The morale of the entire army could not be lowered. The second was the army that brought up the rear. When the army retreated, it had to prevent the enemy from counterattacking and pursuing them. The army that brought up the rear had to be led by elite. Only then could it steadily stabilize the rear for the main force and buy enough time for the army to retreat calmly without the danger of being counterattacked by the enemy. In a cold weapon war, the commander of these two armies would always choose cavalry whenever he had the choice. The reason was very simple. There was no need to talk about the vanguard. Cavalry was fast and had strong mobility. Moving ahead of the main force, it naturally had to have the momentum of wind and fire. The army that brought up the rear had cavalry. First, it could ensure combat strength. Second, after completing the task of bringing up the rear, they could use the cavalry's strong mobility to ensure a smooth escape from the battlefield and not be surrounded and swallowed up by the enemy. Manninger's foolish move was that the 5,000 troops he left behind to bring up the rear were all infantrymen. In fact, Manninger was not really out of his mind. It was just that at this moment, he really had no other choice. He had thousands of cavalry with him at this moment, but he was worried about the new city. He wanted nothing more than to grow wings and fly to the new city. He wanted nothing more than to rush to the new city in the blink of an eye. At this moment, in order to take back his base, it would be good to be a little faster. Therefore, he gathered all the cavalry together as the vanguard and quickly rushed to the new city first. The ones in charge of bringing up the rear could only be infantrymen. It had always been a taboo to have infantrymen bring up the rear. This was because the troops that were left behind to bring up the rear would inevitably have the thought that they had been abandoned. It would be better if they were cavalry. After the battle, they could still run. But infantrymen relied on their two legs. If there was an accident, they could not run away. It was inevitable that the morale of the army would be shaken. When bringing up the rear, they would most likely not be determined to fight to the death. How could Manninger not be aware of this situation? It was just that in this situation, he had to weigh the pros and cons. After all, the new city was more important than anything else. He even had a thought in his mind. Even if the thousands of troops behind him were really eaten up, as long as he could take back the new city, it would be worth it. Moreover, he still had some hope. The Byzantine army on the other side seemed to be lacking in food. After being besieged for so many days, the morale of the troops was naturally low. At this time, with the lack of food and low morale, they might not have the guts to attack. The 5,000 men left behind to bring up the rear might not even need to use their weapons. But Manninger had miscalculated. Although Greene's army was indeed lacking in food, Greene had always been able to do one thing. His troops, the infantrymen, had already begun to reduce their daily rations from 70% to 50%. On the other hand, Sarba's cavalry was well prepared with rations every day, not missing a single grain. Greene had been in the army for a long time and naturally understood a principle. Regardless of whether they won a battle, they had to pursue and attack, or if they lost a battle, they had to break out. They had to rely on their cavalry. Therefore, ensuring the combat effectiveness of their cavalry was the most important. At night, just as Manninger's army set out to return to the new city, less than half a day after the army left, Greene launched a counterattack that night. The cavalry regiment led by Sharba, thousands of cavalry poured out in full force, fiercely pouncing on the troops left behind by Manninger. The news of the defeat of the rearguard reached Manninger's army in the middle of the night. At this moment, his tens of thousands of troops were under his strict orders, taking advantage of the night's snow to rush towards the new city. The army had only set out for half a day. After all, they hadn't gone too far. The distance between them and the rearguard wasn't too far, so the news from the rear could be considered fast. After vomiting blood, Manninger's body gradually couldn't take it anymore. His spirit was dispirited, and he couldn't even ride a horse anymore. He could only sit in a carriage. When the news of the defeat of the rearguard reached Manninger's hands, his trusted aides were originally worried that this bad news would make the patriarch vomit blood again in anger. But after Manninger heard the news, he only remained silent for a while, then sighed softly and said in a low voice, "I know." His tone was as if he had already expected this result. This guess wasn't wrong. Manninger had indeed guessed that the thousands of rearguard soldiers were most likely doomed. Since he had sent the cavalry to the new city, he had already planned to lose this rearguard. But he didn't expect this rearguard to be defeated so quickly. His army hadn't even left for half a day, and the news of their defeat had already reached him. What made him even more worried was that to be able to defeat his thousands of rearguard soldiers so quickly, the strength of this Byzantine army seemed to be very valiant. Furthermore, Manninger immediately determined that the other party must have used cavalry, and it must be elite cavalry with valiant fighting strength. Otherwise, how could the 5,000 troops he had left behind be defeated so quickly? They weren't trash either. Cavalry! Cavalry! This Byzantium commander was indeed a capable fellow. The army was lacking in food, but he was still able to preserve the strength of his cavalry. He definitely wasn't a mediocre person, but Manninger had no other choice. His cavalry had already departed from the main army and headed south to the new city. At this moment, although the army was rushing forward with all their might, there were no cavalry left in the army. Even if he gathered the scouts and his personal guards, there were only a few hundred cavalry. Such a small amount of cavalry was really not enough. Manninger realized the mistake he had made. It wasn't that he didn't leave any cavalry behind. It was that he didn't leave any cavalry behind in his main army. The current situation had caused Manninger to enter a dangerous situation. Although he had tens of thousands of soldiers by his side, he didn't have any cavalry, and the enemy's cavalry was said to number over 3,000 to 4,000. If his tens of thousands of soldiers were to set up camp, he naturally wouldn't be afraid. But right now they were in the middle of a march, and the morale of his troops was somewhat unstable. In theory, as long as the cavalry was elite, it wasn't impossible for them to defeat tens of thousands of infantrymen in a field battle. Cavalry liked to run and fight the most and hated stand and fight the most. Infantrymen, on the other hand, liked stand and fight the most and feared run and fight the most. His army was in the middle of a march in the field, and this was the standard run-and-fight situation. Even if the enemy didn't have the ability to do so, with thousands of cavalry entangling him and biting him, he wouldn't be able to do anything. After all, he only had infantrymen by his side. Once they hit, they would run. Two-legged soldiers would never be able to catch up to four-legged soldiers. In the current situation, he was completely on the receiving end of a beating. A bad move, this was indeed a bad move. If he were to give the order to split off another army to cover the rear, that wouldn't do. Since the enemy could eat up one of his troops, they would have the ability to eat another one. In a war, the biggest taboo was to add fuel to the fire. Otherwise, he would use his superior military strength to fiercely eat up the enemy. Splitting up his troops bit by bit to resist was the most foolish choice. No matter how capable Manninger was, he was in a difficult situation at this moment. The current situation was no longer a matter of whether or not he could retake the new city. Manninger even had to worry about whether his tens of thousands of soldiers would be able to return to the new city in one piece under the relentless pursuit of the enemy's cavalry. At this moment, he was like a large herd of slow-moving bulls. The enemy was a small pack of wolves. Although the herd of bulls was large and the wolves were few, the mobility and speed of the two sides were the exact opposite. One mistake and he was completely on the defensive. What Manninger didn't know was that not only was there a threat behind him, there was an even bigger attack waiting for him in front. Everyone, have a good weekend. Another important announcement. Tomorrow, which is Saturday, I need to take a break. Tomorrow I need to go out and take care of something. Also, I don't think I'll be able to make it back home that day, so I won't be able to update. However, the day after tomorrow is Sunday, so I'll update and make it up. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 470. GOR Chapter 433 Breaking Out of the Cage, Part 9. In order to rush to the new city as quickly as possible, Manninger pulled out almost all of his cavalry and formed them into an army. On the day of their departure, they left the main army and rushed towards the new city. This cavalry unit had about 3,000 riders, but it was all that Manninger could muster. After all, Odin's army was not known for its cavalry. The Odin's reindeer cavalry, from a battle perspective, leaned more towards the use of heavy cavalry. The reindeer's heavy weight and strong ability to carry loads, as well as their short-distance charging ability, were all better than the average horse. However, this type of mount was ultimately different from horses and could not be bred on a large scale. Thus, even in the Scarlet Snow Army, one of the top armies in the Odin Empire, at its peak, the entire army only maintained a few thousand reindeer cavalry. For this invasion to the south, Manninger had brought all of his family's resources with him. Thousands of reindeer cavalrymen from his clan had followed the army to the south. They had also restocked some horses that they had captured from Byzantium in Ilton County. In total, they only had 5,000 to 6,000 reindeer cavalrymen. However, the problem was that Manninger had left some men behind in the Winter War, so the total number of reindeer cavalry that followed the army was less than 4,000. Now, under Manninger's strict orders, these 4,000 reindeer cavalry mustered all of their strength and rushed towards the new city day and night. Manninger's orders were simple and clear. Within 2 days, regardless of the cost, they must reach the new city. Directly attack the city. Although Manninger was flustered and exasperated, he did not completely lose his composure. He was certain that the number of enemy troops that attacked his base was not large. With thousands of reindeer cavalry rushing over, perhaps they could rely on a surprise attack to catch the enemy off guard. If they could take back the city in one go, that would naturally be for the best. Even if they could not, the cavalry could quickly return and exert pressure on the enemy in the city, not giving the enemy time and opportunity to set up the city's defenses. In Manninger's mind, even if these thousands of reindeer cavalry were to give it their all, it was still far less valuable than the new city. Under his orders, the thousands of reindeer cavalry that were originally used as heavy cavalry had no choice but to act like ducks on a perch. They assumed the posture of light cavalry and rushed towards Zankson City. Reindeer mounts weren't good at running long distances. In order to save horsepower, the thousands of cavalrymen had already changed their heavy armor into light leather armor to reduce their weight. Moreover, they had only brought a small amount of rations. However, after running for a day and a night, both the warriors and the mounts were exhausted. Fortunately, the continent was still relatively unobstructed, and Odin's warriors had always been tough men who had endured hardship. Galloping all the way, they finally didn't delay the time set by Manning's order. At noon on the second day, the army was less than 200 li away from the new city. Based on this speed, they should be able to reach the new city by night. Since Ilton County was a large grain-producing county, other than the flat plains within its borders, there were also many rivers and lakes. During winter, the rivers were naturally frozen. At this moment, the army had arrived at a riverbank. Following this riverbank to the south, the river would turn around a bend. After passing this bend and following the main road, they would arrive at the new city. Thousands of reindeer cavalry galloped together. The scene was naturally very shocking. Thousands of reindeer cavalry spread out across the land, splashing snow and mud as they galloped. When the army arrived at the riverbank, the leader of the reindeer cavalry slowly stopped and immediately ordered the army to take a break here. Although the men could eat while they were marching, the reindeer mounts couldn't take it anymore. Most importantly, they needed to drink water. After the army stopped, the thousands of reindeer cavalry formed up beside the riverbank. The cavalry dismounted and took advantage of this short period of time to rest. Some ate, while others put the reindeers next to feed their reindeer mount. The leader of the reindeer cavalry naturally sent men to the riverbank to break open the layer of ice on the river to get water. After breaking open a layer of ice along the riverbank, he ordered groups of reindeer cavalry to bring their reindeer mounts to drink water. The weather was so cold and they hadn't rested for a day and a night. No matter how hard-working Odin men were, they still couldn't take it. Moreover, everyone knew that they had lost the new city, and they were under a lot of pressure. During this march, everyone's faces were gloomy. They were no longer as high-spirited as they were when they set off for battle. Groups took turns to drink the reindeer from the riverbank. When it was the fourth group's turn, they suddenly heard a warning whistle from the Odin soldiers who were in charge of keeping watch in the distance. The whistle came very quickly and the leader of the Odin cavalry's expression immediately changed. The sound of hurried horse hooves came from downstream of the riverbank. Then, they saw a group of cavalry bearing the banner of Byzantium approaching them. Although Odin's people were exhausted, they were still elites after all. They whistled and immediately gathered in formation under the command of their leader. Even the cavalry that had been drinking deer by the river got on their deer and rushed towards the main road. The Byzantium cavalry in the distance looked like they had a lot of mount. However, when they got closer, Odin could see that there were only 500 to 600 of them. It was just that each person had 3 mounts, which made the group look much bigger. On the road, when they suddenly encountered enemies, these Odin cavalry did not hesitate. They took down their axes, swords and other weapons and quickly got into formation. The cavalry in the distance was naturally the 600 cavalrymen that Shea had brought with him. Shea was leading this cavalry from afar. In fact, he had been waiting near the riverbank for a long time. This was the main road for the Odin's men to return to the new city. He led the cavalry downstream of the riverbank to rest and recuperate. The moment Odin's cavalry arrived, he would immediately lead his men to charge over. The 600 cavalry charged over on the main road. However, when they were still an arrow's distance away, the entire army suddenly stopped. The two groups of cavalry faced each other from afar. Shea smiled coldly and turned back to shout, "The prey has arrived. Everyone, prepare to harvest the heads of the Odin's men. For every kill, we will reward you with a gene of meat and a bag of wine." In this winter, whether it was Shea or Manninger, both sides were short on food. A gene of meat and wine as a reward was already a generous reward. In addition, Shea's cavalry had won every battle since they came south. They had already accumulated enough spirit in their hearts. When they heard Shea's words, the entire army roared loudly. Shea deliberately raised his hand slowly and urged his horse forward. He raised his left hand and opened his palm, urging his horse to gradually leave the formation. From afar, the leader of the Odin's cavalry saw this and was startled. This was a common gesture used by the cavalry when two countries were at war. The ones who used this gesture were usually the cavalry or the officers who came out to shout. Could it be that these few hundred cavaliers of the Byzantine Empire want to fight with us in a fair and square battle? Although the Odin's cavalry was surprised by the sudden appearance of the Byzantium cavalry, they were not afraid or flustered. After all, they had more than 3,000 elites, and the enemy only had 500 to 600. Shea urged his horse forward a few steps and stopped. He shouted loudly in Odin's language, "I am the Byzantium general Shea Thunder. The Odin's men on the other side, call your highest-ranking leader out." When two armies were at war, it was normal for the highest-ranking generals of both sides to shout at each other. Firstly, it was to issue a challenge to the other side, and secondly, it was to boost the morale of their own side. The leader of the Odin's cavalry did not suspect anything. He only felt that it was strange. With so few soldiers on the other side, it was most likely a patrol from the Byzantine army that occupied the new city. According to common sense, they should have immediately turned around and retreated when they met our cavalry. Why did they have the guts to fight us? This cavalry leader was also one of the top warriors in the Scarlet Snow army. Otherwise, Manninger would not have handed over thousands of his cavalry to a nameless junior. This Odin's valiant general laughed coldly. He slowly took a few steps forward and shouted proudly, "I am a warrior under the command of Manninger of the Scarlet Snow army." Poor fellow, this fellow only managed to say half a sentence. He did not even manage to call out his own name. Shea on the other side was not interested in listening to him anymore. A smug smile flashed across the country bumpkin's eyes, and he suddenly raised his right hand quickly. He was already holding a long spear in his hand. He held it in his hand and swung it forward. Poor Odin's valiant general. He was about to announce his name according to the usual practice when he suddenly saw a black light on the other side. It was accompanied by a howling gust of wind, and it instantly appeared in front of him. This Odin's valiant general was indeed a warrior in the Scarlet Snow army. Suddenly, he roared and raised his battle axe quickly. He faced the black light in front of him and swung it down fiercely. At the same time, his body had already dodged to the side, unfortunately, with Shea's current strength, and with the intention of a sneak attack. There was no way he could dodge it. With a pew sound, the long spear directly pierced through the chest of this Odin's valiant general. His body flew backward from the back of the deer and crashed into his own formation. Shea's shot was extremely powerful. Not only did the long spear pierce through this Odin's valiant general, it also pierced through 3 of the cavalry behind him. Finally, it nailed one of the Odin's cavalrymen to the ground. The Odin's cavalrymen were shocked and angry. Before they could react, Shea had already raised his flaming fork and shouted, "Kill!" He took the lead and charged forward on his own. Behind him, the hundreds of cavalrymen also let out a roar and charged forward. Shea's first move was to assassinate the enemy's highest-ranking general. Without a leader to command these Odin's men, they were naturally a group of dragons without a leader. Seeing Shea leading his men to charge forward, even the Odin's men were in a mess for a moment. And the more shameless thing was yet to come. Before the 600 cavalrymen could reach them, whistling sounds could be heard from the opposite side. The 600 Byzantium cavalrymen suddenly threw out all the spears in their hands. 600 spears, in addition to the fact that these 600 cavalrymen were all strengthened warriors with great strength, and with the help of the horse's power, the 600 spears suddenly shot down. Miserable cries could be heard. The Odin's cavalrymen were thrown off their horses. Among the thousands of cavalrymen, a group of them were instantly pierced down. By the time the Odin's men reacted, Shea was already in front of them. He took the lead, and the flaming fork in his hand instantly erupted with a red light. Crimson killing intent erupted, and a red light instantly enveloped an area of 20 to 30 steps to the left and right. Shea swung his flaming fork in a circle and blood sprayed out in all directions. Those Odin's cavalrymen who were within the range of his crimson killing intent were all chopped down along with their mounts. Shea had already charged into the midst of the Odin's men. Everywhere he went, he was invincible. His flaming fork rose and fell. Amidst the red light, heads flew up into the sky and blood sprayed out. The 600 cavalrymen behind him had also arrived in an instant. Like a sharp knife, they viciously plunged into the midst of the Odin's men. Shameless! Shameless! Sneak attacking midway is one thing. Charging in while the enemy is resting and drinking water is one thing. Disregarding honor, assassinating the enemy's commander is one thing. What made the Odin's cavalrymen the most helpless was that these Byzantium cavalrymen were actually equipped with a pair of lances. After throwing out the lances in their hands, these Byzantium cavalrymen immediately took out the spare lances and sabers hanging from their saddles. 600 cavalrymen, together with Shea's invincible vanguard, charged forward. On the other hand, the Odin's men had been galloping for an entire day and night. Both men and horses were exhausted beyond words. Most importantly, for the sake of traveling light, these Odin's cavalrymen had abandoned the heavy armor that they were most accustomed to. In this kind of situation where the cavalrymen engaged in close combat, the light leather armor that they were wearing would undoubtedly cause them to lose 30% of their combat prowess. Shea took the lead. Everywhere he went, blood and flesh splattered. Regardless of whether it was a valiant general or a valiant warrior of the Odins, none of them could withstand a single blow from his flaming fork. The enemy's cavalrymen had already charged into the enemy's formation. Even though these Odin's cavalrymen had the advantage in numbers and were all elites, the enemy's cavalrymen were charging forward and borrowing the momentum of their charge, while their own cavalrymen were running around in circles. This time, without the command of their commander, they could only fight on their own. After resisting for a while, the Odin's cavalrymen finally couldn't hold on any longer. The next moment, in less than 15 minutes, the cavaliers of Odin barely managed to resist the attacks of the cavaliers of the Byzantine Empire, and the cavaliers of the Odin Empire were sliced into pieces by the cavaliers of Byzantine. Shea charged forward in a single breath, the flaming fork in his hand, taking the lives of countless Odin's cavalrymen. Just as he felt his heart burning and his killing intent soaring to the heavens, he suddenly felt his vision clearing up. He widened his eyes and realized that he had already killed his way through the Odin's formation. With a standard chisel, he charged out from the back of the Odin's formation. Shea laughed heartily and urged his horse to take 2 steps forward. Then, he turned his horse around. Behind him, his cavalrymen charged out from the enemy's formation. This chisel tactic could be said to be a textbook example. Shea laughed loudly and let out a long whistle. Hundreds of cavalrymen quickly gathered around him. Then, without taking a breather, Shea raised his flaming fork and charged into the Odin's formation once again. The chaotic Odin's cavalrymen had lost their commander. Even though some of the officers were desperately shouting orders, the valiant Byzantium cavalrymen had turned around and charged back at them. This time, the Odin's cavalrymen finally couldn't hold on any longer. Utter defeat. A defeat that sent chills down the spines of Odin's spine. A shocking scene appeared on the plains. Thousands of Odin's reindeer cavalrymen were chased all over the mountains and plains. Behind them, there were only a few hundred Byzantine army cavalrymen chasing after them. The most pitiful part was that the reindeer mounts of Odin's cavalrymen had already galloped for a day and night. Even if they wanted to run, they couldn't outrun the enemy's horses. Countless Odin's cavalrymen were caught up by the Byzantium cavalrymen behind them. Those Byzantium cavalrymen directly chopped down their reindeer with a single slash. After that, They didn't even look at them and continued their pursuit. This pursuit lasted for more than 100 li. Along the way, countless Odin's cavalrymen were running. Their reindeer mounts couldn't hold on any longer and finally fell to the ground. The Byzantium cavalrymen caught up and ended their lives with a single slash. After more than 100 li of pursuit, the number of Odin's cavalrymen became thinner and thinner. Finally, when the Byzantium cavalrymen behind them finally stopped their pursuit and retreated, the Odin's cavalrymen continued to gallop for a long distance before finally stopping to reorganize their troops. This reorganization made the arrogant Odin's cavalrymen unable to even cry. More than 3,000 cavalrymen set out, but after reorganizing, there were less than 800 of them left. Furthermore, most of them were injured. Shea gathered his cavalrymen and split up a few small teams to chase after the scattered Odin's cavalrymen. After another 4 hours, the cavalrymen that were sent out to clean up the remaining cavalrymen returned one after another. The returning cavalrymen all had a murderous look on their faces. They were full of vigor, and their horses were all covered in heads. After a quick count, at least 1,000 Odin's cavalrymen were killed in this battle. As for those who were scattered, there were also several hundred who were killed during the pursuit. All in all, they killed about 2,000 enemies, with 600 cavalrymen against 5 to 6 times the enemy's cavalrymen. Such a result was glorious. On Shea's side, more than 20 people died, 100 people were lightly injured, and 14 people were seriously injured. Cut off the heads of these Odin's men and pile them up in the middle of the road. Shea kept his fiery fork and let out a long sigh. He sneered, "When Manninger's army comes, they will see these heads. Let's make them tremble in fear." A cavalryman beside him asked, "Sir, this was a satisfying battle. What are we going to do next? Are we going to attack the main force of Odin's army?" Shea laughed. His cavalrymen seemed to be motivated by their continuous victories. Just a few hundred cavalrymen, and they were going to attack the main force of Odin's army. However, the people below him were hot-headed, but Shea himself couldn't be like this. He shook his head and smiled. "There's no hurry. We still have important things to do. We want to destroy the Scarlet Snow Army. This small number of people is not enough. I have already left an ambush along the way to the south. We will go and meet the reinforcements and gather under the new city. We will send Manninger back to his mother *King hometown in one battle, ha 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 ha." Odin's vanguard cavalrymen were defeated all the way to the north. They followed the main road and headed towards Manninger's main force. Manninger, on the other hand, was worried. Sharba led thousands of cavalrymen behind him and harassed them along the way. Every time they came, they would charge and kill for a while before leaving immediately. Manninger's rear team had suffered a lot of damage due to the continuous early attack. Sharba seemed to have gained experience. He came and went like the wind in every battle and was not greedy for credit. There were a few times when Odin's troops were about to surround them when he immediately led his men away without any hesitation. With Sharba harassing them from behind, the speed of Manninger's main force was reduced by more than half. Manninger could only do his best to reorganize the rear of the army and be on high alert. However, the speed of the army's march made Manninger worried. With such a march, he didn't know how much time it would take to reach the new city. After walking for a day and a night, Sharba had led his men to attack the enemy 13 times. Although they only killed or injured Odin's men each time, they could not withstand such a slow fire. Odin's men were annoyed and annoyed. They couldn't do anything to the enemy and their morale was inevitably low. It was not until the next night that Sharba's cavalrymen finally retreated. The cavalrymen must be tired from the continuous attack. Sharba led his men to retreat slightly and reorganize the troop. Without the enemy troops harassing them along the way, Manninger heaved a sigh of relief and ordered the army to speed up. However, at night they received bad news. The defeated vanguard cavalrymen had finally escaped back to the main force. When they set out, there were thousands of cavalrymen showing off their might. When they returned, there were less than 800 cavalrymen. Every one of them was covered in blood and looked miserable. Most of them were injured and their faces were filled with panic and frustration. The news of 800 cavalrymen returning in defeat quickly spread throughout the army. Manninger was on the way when he received the news from the carriage and immediately rushed out. Seeing the 800 cavalrymen running over in a sorry state, Manninger's body swayed. When the cavalrymen returned, there were naturally officers who came forward to report to Manninger. However, when these defeated cavalrymen came before Manninger and reported half of what had happened, they realized that there was something wrong with the face of the patriarch. Pooh! Manninger suddenly opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood. His face, which had just eased up a little, instantly turned pale again. When his left and right went up to support him, this Odin hero's eyes had already closed and he had fainted. The patriarch had vomited blood and fainted. The advancing troops immediately stopped. They could only camp and wait on the main road. Manninger's coma this time was much longer than the previous one. He was unconscious for a whole night and only woke up at noon the next day. When he woke up, he was lying in the carriage. His first reaction was that the carriage didn't feel bumpy under him. It was obvious that the entire army had stopped advancing. Manninger was furious. He turned around and got up. Just as he was about to shout, he felt a sharp pain in his chest and felt short of breath. He gritted his teeth and took a few breaths. After he called out, a close aide heard him and opened the carriage door. Hearing that the patriarch had woken up, the generals and leaders of the army quickly gathered. Manninger was bitter in his heart. It was fine that he had fainted, but the army had actually stopped. These idiots, didn't they know that if the army returned one night later, the danger would increase by a bit? However, looking at the worried faces of his subordinates, he couldn't get angry in his heart. After all, these subordinates were also loyal to him. When they saw him vomit blood and faint, they ordered the army to stop advancing. They were afraid that his body couldn't withstand the bumpy journey. Manninger's anger couldn't be vented, but his heart was cold. The news of the vanguard cavalry's defeat was even more shocking than when he learned that his son Morka had been killed. Thousands of cavalry. Those were thousands of elite cavalrymen. If Odin's reindeer cavalry were to gather thousands of cavalry, it would be enough to defeat a Byzantium infantry regiment in a night battle. Even when he had annihilated the Byzantine Empire's 7th Regiment, he had relied on thousands of cavalry to charge into the formation. With these thousands of cavalry, he had broken through the 7th Regiment's formation, followed by a surprise attack from the infantry to achieve a complete victory. However, these thousands of cavalry were actually defeated by someone. And it was a field battle, a real field battle. A field battle where force met force with force. How was this possible? How could Manninger accept this? According to the cavalry that had been defeated, the enemy only had a few hundred cavalry, but their battle strength was astonishing. Moreover, the enemy's general was brave and unparalleled, as well as sinister and cunning. A few hundred cavalry could defeat my thousands of elite reindeer cavalry? How could the Byzantine army have such a brave and unparalleled general? Even if it was the Roadrear cavalry, personally led by Adrik, it was absolutely impossible for a few hundred cavalry to defeat his thousands of cavalry. In Manninger's heart, it was simply absurd to the extreme. Advance, continue to advance to the new city. Facing the concern and silence of the generals, Manninger only coldly gave this simple order. Patriarch. A subordinate couldn't help but speak up, but Manninger glared fiercely at him, immediately shutting him up. I know that you're all worried that my body won't be able to hold on, but the army plan cannot be changed. I'm not dead yet. I can still endure this bit of turbulence. Manninger gritted his teeth. But if we don't go to the new city, where else can we go? After a moment of silence, someone couldn't help but whisper, There are other towns nearby. We can first find a place to reorganize the troops and let the warriors of the tribe rest a little, coward. Manninger coldly reprimanded. He took a deep breath and slowly said, "Our old nest has been raided. The cavalry that we sent out to return to the city was defeated. At this time, some of you might think that returning to the new city is too dangerous. But let me tell you, right now we have no choice but to return. What did our Odin warriors rely on to go south? It was the bravery and fierceness of our tribal warriors. It was this courage that we relied on. But now our old nest has been raided, and our cavalry has been defeated. The news came one after another, and our army of tens of thousands doesn't even dare to return. We have to go to other places to hide. Don't you think that once this order is given to the entire army, what will the warriors of the army think? They will really be afraid of these Byzantium people from now on. Once we lose our bravery, what are we, the Odin people, left with? The next chapter will be Shea's third anger towards Manninger. Manninger has already vomited blood twice. The third time, it's time for him to go to heaven. Tomorrow's update will be even more exciting, haha. To be continued. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 471. Sorry, this chapter is even later. It is now 1:30 am. It is not that I am slacking off or deliberately writing late. It is just that I had to rewrite and revise this chapter several times. I had to revise this short chapter 3 times. The first time, I wrote a version of 6,000 words. After looking at it, I was not satisfied. The second time, I wrote 8,000 words. Still not enough, I revised it again. In the end, I ended up writing this 10,000-word chapter, GOR Chapter 433 Escape from the Cage 10. There was no doubt that Manninger's persistence had its own reasons. The Odin Empire had always been known for its valiant and courageous warriors. However, in terms of national strength, it was far inferior compared to the Byzantine Empire. If not for the fact that the Byzantine Empire had been trapped by the Tema military district for the past 100 years, causing internal divisions within the empire and a great decline in national strength, the Odin Empire would have found it very difficult to gain the upper hand in the battle between the two empires. Not to mention, the Odin Empire had always been barbaric, unlike the Byzantine Empire, which had produced many wise men. In terms of strategy and wisdom, not even 10 Odin Empire men could match up to one Byzantium man. However, Manninger, a rare hero among the Odin Empire men, was a man of understanding. He was well aware of the gap between the two empires. He was also able to clearly see the situation. The internal strife within the Byzantine Empire had finally erupted. The imperial family and the warlords had finally shed all pretenses of cordiality and started fighting. The national strength had declined to its weakest point in history. It could be said that this was the best opportunity for the Odin Empire men to defeat this most powerful empire in one fell swoop. It was impossible for a better opportunity to appear than this one. Manninger, on the other hand, was clear on one thing: there was only one chance. If they were to miss it now, they could forget about it in the future. After the Great Chaos came the Great Order. After this internal strife, regardless of whether the Byzantium imperial family or the Red Round Table Conference's warlords won, the outcome would be different. However, there was only one outcome: the end of the internal strife. The internal strife would eventually come to an end. Back then, the Byzantine Empire was weak due to the internal strife not erupting. It had gradually weakened the empire's strength. But once the internal strife and conflict completely erupt, it would truly come to an end. Once this civil war ended, no matter which side won, they would start to clean up the mess and slowly recover their national strength. With the Byzantine Empire's foundation, its population, land, and resources far surpassed Odin's. Once the Byzantine Empire stabilized and recovered its strength, it would surpass the Ottoman Empire in a few years. Then, this situation would no longer be decided by Odin's people. Therefore, this was the best chance and also the only chance. Manning had foresight, and his plans were far-reaching. That was why he had mobilized his entire tribe and brought the most elite warriors of his tribe with him. His plan was not just to plunder, but to take advantage of the opportunity to take a big bite out of it, and then conspire to obtain the greatest benefits. He planned for the situation in the next few decades, or even hundreds of years, to lay down a solid foundation. Manning was even more clear that when Odin and Byzantium were fighting each other, Byzantium had the advantage of financial resources, manpower, and various other resources. The only thing that Odin's people could rely on was the courage and valiance that they relied on to survive. The Ottoman Empire was able to suppress the Byzantine Empire for so many years because of this valiance. At this moment, his Scarlet Snow army had suffered setbacks again and again. Their base was raided, the son of the patriarch was beheaded, and the army was chased by the enemy's cavalry. His own elite cavalry was almost completely annihilated by the enemy. One setback after another had shaken the morale of his entire army. This morale was the greatest reliance of the Odin's people. If the Odin's people lost even this courage, then the Odin's people really did not have any capital to fight against the Byzantium. Now, if the entire army moved to other places to hide temporarily and plunder more food from a few towns, it was not impossible for them to get through this winter and slowly recover their strength. However, in the face of such setbacks, his army did not fight with all their might, but moved to hide instead. Once this kind of thing started, once they lost their morale, it would not be so easy to recover. Once the bones softened, it would be very difficult for them to be strong again. Therefore, no matter what, Manning had to brace himself and bring his army to the new city to fight to the death, no matter how big the risk was. But this was his only chance. If he retreated now and escaped, although he could hide for a while and give his entire army a breather, the enemy had already occupied his base, the new city. If he did not face them head-on, the enemy could naturally use this winter to take over the other territories in Ilton County bit by bit. After all, this was the Byzantine Empire. After all, these territories were only conquered by the Scarlet Snow army for half a year. If the Byzantine army took them back and his army recovered, it would be difficult to take them back again. Therefore, Manning was not reckless, but he really did not have a choice. The Scarlet Snow army resumed their journey, and the entire army sped up towards the new city. The speed of the infantry was naturally much slower. After another 2 days of walking, the army walked to the place where Shea had annihilated the Odin's cavalry vanguard a few days ago. In the middle of the road, they saw a few tall piles of human heads. Those human heads piled up like a mountain, they were the heads of the Odin's vanguard cavalry warriors. It had not snowed for the past 2 days, so it was clearly visible. When the army walked here, they were shocked by the scene in front of them. It had always been the Odin's people who brutally slaughtered other tribes, but at this moment, they saw the heads of their own tribe's warriors piled up here. Such a blow was no less than a heavy hammer in the eyes of the Odin's people. Originally, the leaders and generals in the army were worried that if Manning saw this scene in front of them, they were afraid that this already weak tribal chief would be angered again. If he vomited blood again, they were afraid that it would be bad for them. However, they did not expect that Manning, who looked very calm this time, knew that on the road ahead, the heads of his vanguard cavalry had been chopped off by the enemy and piled up in the middle of the road. Instead, he looked very calm, but his face was still pale. He calmly ordered to clear the road and continue moving forward. His calm demeanor made the leaders of the other clans feel uneasy. Manning had vomited blood twice in the past few days and fainted several times. His physical condition was getting worse and worse. Even the personal guards who served by his side, could hear the continuous coughing of the tribal chief in the carriage along the way. The strength of his speech was also getting weaker and weaker. Although Manning still insisted on coming out of the carriage to appear in front of the generals every day to reassure them, his face was getting paler by the day, and it could not be hidden. On the afternoon of the fourth day, the army finally arrived at the new city. At this moment, a full 7 days had passed since the new city was attacked by Shea. The Scarlet Snow Army set up camp outside the city. However, Manning suddenly seemed to have regained some of his strength. The moment the army set up camp, he immediately gathered many of the leaders in the tribe and gave the order to attack the city without hesitation. Tribal Chief, the men have been running for many days, day and night. Many of the brave men in the tribe are so tired that they've vomited blood. It's better to rest for half a day and let everyone recover their strength before giving the order to attack the city. In the face of such a request, Manning only said coldly, "I don't have time to wait. If you don't have the strength, I will personally lead the personal guards to fight." This sentence made the people below dare not disobey. If the dignified commander-in-chief of the Scarlet Snow Army really led the personal guards to fight, then the leaders and generals of the tribes below might as well just slit their own throats and commit suicide. Manning's tough attitude at this moment relied on the prestige he had accumulated over the years to still give the order. The Scarlet Snow Army's camp had not yet stabilized, but they immediately mobilized the soldiers in the army and launched the first wave of attack. In the new city, Nene had already made all the necessary preparations. Although Shea had left, the surrendered soldiers in the city did not do anything else. They were not really loyal, but they were forced to the point where they had no other way out. Now, other than defending to the death and fighting Odin to survive, there was no need to think about anything else. Without any other thoughts, once a person's mind became pure, the efficiency of doing things would naturally increase. The city defense was originally very strong, and Nene had made sufficient preparations these few days, making the new city like an iron bastion. The city walls of the new city were tall, and there were originally a total of 3 city gates. Nene simply asked people to seal the city gates with stones from the inside. Anyway, the military strength in the city was not enough to defend the city, so they did not plan to go out of the city to fight at night. Sealing the city gates was a show of unity. The Scarlet Snow Army's first wave of attack was very imposing. Looking at the black mass of Odin's people below the city, even though the defenders had already made up their minds to fight to the death, many of them could not help but feel numb in their scalps. These were Odin's people. These were the fierce and powerful Odin's people. The defenders in the city were all surrendered soldiers, and they were all defeated by Odin's people in the past. The strength of Odin's people had long left a deep shadow in their hearts. At this moment, in order to survive, they had no choice but to bite the bullet and fight. Nene stood on the city wall, looking at the strange expressions of the defenders on his left and right. His heart skipped a beat, and he raised the long sword in his hand and shouted, "Look at the bodies of those Odin's people below the city. Look at those guys hanging on the city wall. You have no choice. If you want to live, fight to the death." With his roar, a few cavalrymen standing beside him raised their long swords and responded in unison. With these people taking the lead and shouting over and over again, the shouting finally dispelled the fear in the hearts of the defenders. Gradually, shouts of "fight to the death" could be heard from the city walls. At first, it was sparse, but under the lead of Nei and a few cavalrymen, the shouts of "fight to the death" became more and more orderly and louder. When Odin's people attacked the city, a rain of arrows came down from the top of the city wall. A large number of strong crossbows and arrows were stored in the city, and they were piled up like mountains. At this moment, they naturally used all of them without hesitation. Although there were less than 3,000 defenders and they were not brave enough, if they were to fight in the wild, they would probably be destroyed by Odin's people. However, they still had the courage to shoot arrows from the top of the city wall. A few waves of arrow rain caused a lot of damage to Odin's people who were attacking the city. Gradually, after shooting a few arrows, the morale of the defenders finally rose by a lot. Odin's people were also people. Looking at their own bows and arrows, those who were attacking the city under Odin's people also fell to the ground and died, or they were screaming on the ground. The hearts of the defenders gradually became firm. The city gate was already blocked, so the defenders did not need to be distracted. They only needed to guard the city wall and deal with Odin's people who were attacking the city wall. Under Meningo's strict orders, the entire Scarlet Snow army rushed on with all their might. Naturally, they threw away most of the heavy military equipment in order to speed up with light equipment. When attacking the city, they naturally did not have enough equipment. Things like catapults and siege vehicles could not be made in a short period of time. Even for the ladders to climb up the city walls, there were only a dozen of them made in a hurry. Outside the new city was wilderness. Even if there were some small forests in the past, they were all cut down. At this moment, if Odin's people wanted to cut down wood to build siege weapons, it was not something that could be done in a short period of time. Odin's people braved the arrow rain and rushed to the bottom of the city wall. They endured the damage forcefully. When they reached the bottom of the city wall, countless stones and boiling oil immediately fell from the top of the city wall. For a moment, the sound of screams and howls could be heard all over the bottom of the city wall. After enduring a considerable amount of damage, the ladders to climb the city wall were finally set up one by one. Some of the warriors in Odin's army took the lead to climb the ladders and attacked the top of the city wall. Braving the arrow rain and the stones and boiling oil that fell from the sky, although there were people who screamed and fell from the sky from time to time, Odin's people's innate valiance and bravery still supported their determination to fight to the death. However, the defenders were still tenacious. For these surrendered soldiers, if it was in the past, naturally, they would not have this kind of courage. When they saw Odin's people attacking, their instinctive reaction was to throw down their weapons and run away, or bend their knees and surrender. However, there was still a thought in their minds: if the city wall is breached, they will die. In the face of life and death, even the most cowardly person could not help but erupt with courage. The defenders stubbornly resisted. Although there were occasionally Odin's warriors who risked their lives to charge up the city wall, they were immediately surrounded and killed by the defenders. Nai displayed her invincible might. She led dozens of elite cavalrymen around her and ran back and forth on the top of the city wall. Whenever she found a section of the city wall in a state of emergency, Nai would immediately lead the elite cavalrymen to attack. She was a powerful individual and led a group of elite cavalrymen who had been strengthened. These cavalrymen had valiant bodies and great strength. To put it in a joking manner, they were more Odin's men than Odin's men. Whenever a section of the city wall in a state of emergency appeared, Nai would lead the cavalrymen to attack. When the long saber in her hand slashed out, not a single Odin's men could block her attack. The battle on the city wall continued for a long time. Although Odin's men had already done their best, the ladders that had been built up were gradually overturned one by one. Boiling oil was sprinkled from the top of the city wall and torches were thrown down. Some of the ladders were immediately set ablaze. Odin's men fought with all their might for more than 2 hours, but they did not make any progress. The occasional ladders that managed to reach the top of the city wall were instantly extinguished by Nai's men. Manninger was right in front of his army formation. Although his body was weak, he forced himself to stay in front of the army formation and take charge. Seeing that the teams of Odin's warriors that he had sent up were unable to break through the city wall despite risking their lives to fight, the morale of the soldiers gradually began to slacken. He watched as the ladders on the city wall were overturned one by one. Some of them had already turned into raging flames. Manninger finally sighed in disappointment. After fighting for more than 2 hours, he finally waved his hand weakly. Let them fall back. Manninger had no choice but to make this decision. At this moment, although Odin's men had the absolute advantage in terms of military strength, they had traveled a long way and did not have any siege weapons. Even the ladders that they had used to climb up the city wall were only a dozen or so, and they had only been made at the last minute. Right now, although he still had sufficient military strength, those ladders had all been destroyed. He couldn't really let his soldiers use their heads to smash the city wall. Moreover, Manninger knew that he was taking a risk. Attacking a city immediately after the arrival of an army was a taboo in war. However, Manninger still had some hope in his heart. The new city had only been lost for a few days, and the defenders in the city were not stable yet. Those vassal soldiers who had surrendered were afraid of him, and might not dare to fight to the death. In a spurt of energy, they might be able to break through. Unfortunately, this idea of luck was finally dispelled after the risk failed. It seemed that this attempt had failed, and Manninger had no choice but to make a new plan. Pass down the order. 1 night of rest. Every camp will build siege weapons overnight. I want to see 100 ladders tomorrow. Manninger had no choice but to accept this fact. However, the haze on his face deepened. He coughed a few times in the cold wind and returned to the carriage to rest under the escort of his guards. At this moment, he really could not stand the cold wind anymore. The clan leader's order was passed down, and the entire army rushed to build siege weapons overnight. Although the surrounding forest was almost completely cut down, the army could only send out small teams to search the forest in all directions. Some of them had no choice but to dismantle the carriages and wooden boxes that accompanied the army, and even the fences used to set up camp, to build siege weapons. This night, the Scarlet Snow Army's camp was in full swing, and they were busy for an entire night. Manninger rested in his own carriage, but his heart was burning with anger. How could he really fall asleep? This night, he tossed and turned, and there was only a faint sense of uneasiness in his heart. A sense of decadence from failure surged into his heart again and again, causing Manninger's heart to beat non-stop. When it was almost dawn, he turned over and was about to call for help when he suddenly heard hurried shouts from outside. "Clan leader! Sir! Clan leader! Not good! Not good! There's a fire in the city!" When he heard this voice, Manninger did not know where he got the strength from, but he suddenly jumped up and kicked open the carriage door. He did not even put on his clothes or shoes before he rushed out barefoot. Beneath his feet was the icy cold snow, and the sky above his head was still gray. The sky had not really lit up yet, and it was now dawn. Manninger stood in the snow, his bare feet stepping on the icy cold snow, and this chill seemed to spread from his feet and legs all the way to his heart. His eyes were fixed in the direction of the new city. Fire! Under the gray sky, there was a fire in the sky above the new city, and it was so obvious. It was so eye-catching and shocking. Billows of thick black smoke rose into the sky. The reflection of the fire seemed to have dyed the sky red. From afar, in the dark night, the fire seemed to be especially fierce. And the direction of the fire was in the new city. There were already many tribal generals and leaders in the army who had rushed over after hearing the news and gathered around Manninger. Some looked at the fire in the city and stomped their feet and thumped their chests, while others stomped their feet and cursed loudly. There were also people who looked at Manninger with dismay. "Sir, clan leader, they set the city on fire. Our warehouse, our things." However, after the people shouted for a long time, Manninger himself did not make a sound, and only quietly stared at the new city in the distance. It was as if at this moment, the backbone of the Scarlet Snow Army, the pillar of support, was completely stunned. Finally, under the continuous calls of the people beside him, Manninger finally turned his head and swept his gaze across the generals present. What kind of gaze was this? The people beside him could clearly see that their commander's eyes were red. "Good, good, good," Manninger repeatedly said, "good," and then he took a deep breath. His pale face was suffused with a strange red color, and the corner of his mouth even revealed a strange smile. "Good, good." Manninger's voice, word by word, was like a cold bird crying blood. His tone was indescribably mournful. "Good, good. This commander of the Byzantine army is ruthless. He blocked the city gate, cut off his own path of survival, and set the city on fire, burning all of our stored goods. He cut off his own path of survival, and he also cut off our path of survival. Such a ruthless person must be someone with great wisdom and courage. I, Manninger, lose to such a hero, it's not a loss. Good, good, good. Ha 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 ha." With this last string of wild laughter, Manninger suddenly opened his mouth again and spat out a mouthful of blood, which fell on the snowy ground like specks of pear blossoms. That majestic figure fell down with a loud crash. Manninger spat out blood again and fell down, and the people around him were in a mess. Someone rushed over and helped the commander up in a flurry. However, this time, Manninger did not faint. He was supported by a few people, but his eyes were still wide open, and the blood in his mouth was still spitting out mouthful after mouthful. Seeing the clan leader spit out blood again and again, everyone panicked. By the time they carried Manninger back into the carriage, his chest was already covered in blood, and even his beard was dyed red. A magus from the army came over to save him and gave him medicine, but just as it was given, he spat out blood again. Some of his personal guards and leaders who had followed him for many years were panic-stricken. Some of them even shed tears on the spot. Some of them even started bawling. Manninger continued to spit out blood, but he did not faint. He looked at the people around him trying to save him, and the magus in the army gave him medicine and cast spells on him. From beginning to end, this hero Odin only had his eyes open, but his gaze was calm. Finally, after the silk handkerchief used to wipe his mouth had been dyed red, Manninger finally stopped spitting out blood. Manninger did not seem to hear the shouts of the people around him. He only opened his eyes and looked at the roof of the carriage. His gaze was still calm, and he seemed to be thinking about something. Seeing that their commander had finally stopped spitting out blood, the people below heaved a sigh of relief. However, at this moment, Manninger suddenly spoke. "Gather my personal guards and surround the carriage. No one is allowed to come within 20 steps of it. Those who disobey will be killed immediately." Manninger said each word calmly. Although his voice was weak, his tone seemed to have recovered some of the murderous aura of the past. "All the leaders and generals of the army, come and listen to my instructions. If anyone does not come, kill them immediately." This was the second order. When these two orders were given, the people around him trembled. After giving out these two orders, Manninger closed his eyes and waited quietly. With these two strict orders, the army immediately moved. In a short while, all the leaders and generals of the Scarlet Snow Army and the tribes gathered. Around the carriage, hundreds of Manninger's personal guards had already surrounded the area within 20 steps of the carriage. Manninger gave another order to lift his carriage so that the gathered generals could see him from the side of the carriage. At this moment, his expression was strange and his tone was cold. No one dared to disobey. Although they knew that the chief was seriously ill and could not be exposed to the wind, and that the order to lift the carriage was somewhat inappropriate, Manninger had already made it clear that those who disobeyed would be killed immediately. Merciless. When everyone had gathered, Manninger suddenly seemed to have recovered some of his energy. He did not even need anyone to help him. He slowly sat up on the soft couch in the carriage. Then, his sharp gaze slowly swept across the entire crowd. Everyone who was swept by his gaze subconsciously lowered their heads. Everyone had a faint understanding in their hearts. "After I die, you don't have to panic." Manninger slowly said the first sentence. Suddenly, everyone present turned pale with fright. Someone could not help but cry out. Manninger coldly shouted, "No nonsense at this moment. Before I finish speaking, no one is allowed to interrupt. If anyone makes a fuss, kill them immediately. Once the strict order was given, those who were shouting hurriedly shut their mouth. Manninger took a deep breath and looked at the generals and leaders of the tribes around him. After all, they were all subordinates who had followed him for many years. His gaze softened slightly. You don't have to panic. Everyone has to die. At this moment I am already unconscious. My life is at stake. Now I have a few words for you. Listen up, it's best if you do as I say. But if anyone disobeys after this, I won't be able to see it after I die anyway. At this point, Manninger deliberately paused and looked at the crowd. Only then did the people below dare to speak. They all shouted loudly, "We don't dare disobey the chief's orders." Very good. Manninger coughed twice. His voice was weak, but his tone was still calm. After I die, the entire army does not need to continue attacking the city. Immediately mobilize the army and head north. The army will move slowly towards the north. Along the way, if the cities and towns are still in our hands, we will plunder their provisions. If the Byzantium army has already occupied them, we will go around the city. There is no need to tangle with them. At this point, he coughed again and a trace of blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. Manninger wiped it away casually and continued, "The army will head north. As long as you calm the hearts of the soldiers and be careful along the way, there is no need to be fast. Even if the Byzantine army sends cavalry to harass you, as long as you don't pay attention to them, be careful and don't split up your troops to fight them, they will not be able to do anything to you. I know that this journey will be difficult and dangerous. From here, pass Ilton County, pass Moore County, all the way north. From the Wildfire Plains, we will return to our Odin Empire. As long as we can walk out of Moore County, our path to survival will be clear." After these words were spoken, the expressions of the people below changed. At this time, since the Odin people were crude by nature, one of the tribal leaders could not help but speak up, "Chief, you don't have to be so dispirited. We still have tens of thousands of soldiers. This new city is not enough. We will definitely be able to take it tomorrow, when that time comes." When Manninger heard this, a trace of viciousness flashed across his eyes. He raised his hand and pointed at the person who spoke, "Kill him!" At his command, a few of his personal guards immediately rushed up and pressed the tribal leader who spoke to the ground. That person was terrified and begged for mercy. However, a personal guard had already pulled out a knife and stabbed it into his neck. With a swoosh, his head was chopped off. Manninger sighed, "Is there anyone else who wants to say anything?" Who else dared to speak up? Everyone knelt on the ground and said loudly, "We do not dare to disobey the chief." Good. Manninger's face turned even more ashen. He took a deep breath and swept his gaze across the crowd. After a moment of hesitation, he said, "Fielding, stay behind. The rest of you, return to your respective camp. Go organize the army." The people below looked at each other. Finally, they were all driven away by the personal guards of the chief. Only the man named Fielding, whom Manninger had named, remained kneeling beside the carriage. This man named Fielding was in his 40s. He wore a leather coat and had a rather majestic appearance. He looked just like a typical Odin man. However, compared to the other Odin men, his eyes were more steady. Manninger sighed softly, "Fielding, you are one of the elders of my tribe. Normally, you do things steadily. There are some things that I can only entrust to you. Only then can I feel at ease." Fielding knelt on the ground and bowed his head repeatedly. Manninger looked at the other party's attitude, and a hint of satisfaction flashed through his eyes. He took a few more breaths, then slowly said, "The battle is no longer under our control. Retreating is imperative. After I die, I'll leave this matter to you. My personal guard battalion will be under your command. If anyone refuses to comply, you can directly kill them." "Yes." Fielding hesitated for a moment. A hint of pain flashed through his eyes, but he finally nodded. We Odin men are too proud. At this moment, we still have tens of thousands of soldiers. Even if I die, most likely there will be people who refuse to accept it and will continue to attack the new city. However, there are some things that others don't understand. After I say it, only you can understand. There are so many elders in the tribe, but I've always trusted you the most. This is because you have a clear mind. You are a rare talent among our Odin men. We Odin men don't lack bravery. What we lack, however, is people with brains. At this point, Manninger's voice grew weaker. If we were to forcefully attack the city, we would naturally be able to take it. However, after taking it, it would be futile. The provisions and military equipment stored in the new city have all been burned by the Byzantium. Our foundation has been shaken. We can no longer stay in Ilton County. If I was still alive and leading the army, I might still be able to lead the troops here and continue to contend with them. But now that I'm dead, although there are many brave generals in the army, there is no one who can lead the army. If we continue to fight, it will only be a path to death. The commander of this Byzantine army is very impressive. Every move he makes is to force us into a dead end. Just now, I have been thinking about it for a long time, but I still can't figure it out. The advantage was clearly in my favor. How could the enemy turn the situation around? Heh. I, Manninger, have been proud all my life. To meet such an opponent, even if I lose, it is not a loss. We have lost our foundation. Even if we take the new city, it will only be an empty shell. The other cities and towns in Ilton County will probably be incited by the Byzantium. We, the guest army, cannot stay here any longer. If we continue to fight, these tens of thousands of tribal elites will all die here. If we, the Bashak tribe, lose these tens of thousands of elites, we will inevitably be swallowed up by other tribes in the future. Fielding, what I am entrusting to you today is the life and death of the Bashak tribe. When Fielding heard this, he finally raised his head. With tears in his eyes, he said, "Chief, I will remember this. I will not dare to disobey you in the slightest." Manninger's face was full of fatigue, but there was a hint of relief in his eyes. "Good. What else do you want to ask? Ask away now." Fielding did not hesitate and asked directly, "After you, Chief, who will be the leader of the tribe?" Manninger nodded. "My second son is still in the tribe. Although he is only 17 years old, there are still tens of thousands of youths in the tribe. You will lead these tens of thousands of warriors back. If you can assist them to the best of your ability, I will do my best to assist your son," Fielding said without hesitation. After a pause, Fielding could not help but ask, "If I lead the army back to the north, what will I do if the Byzantium army intercepts me?" Manninger heard this and said calmly, "If it is a small disturbance, ignore it and retreat." Fielding hesitated for a moment. "What if the army comes?" Manninger heard this and his eyes froze. He was silent for a while before he exhaled and said slowly, "The Byzantium army has already won. After all, they do not have many soldiers. Since we are retreating, I think the commander of the Byzantium army might not be willing to sacrifice his men to fight us to the death. After all, we still have tens of thousands of warriors. If we really fight them to the death, even if they win, the losses will not be small. Right now, Byzantium is already in chaos. In this chaotic world, everyone is trying to strengthen their own strength. Who would be willing to do such a strenuous and unrewarding thing? This Byzantium commander should be a smart person, so…" Fielding frowned and looked at the patriarch. After hesitating for a while, he still could not help but say, "But if the enemy really gathers their army to intercept us, I should." Manninger's facial muscles trembled as he stared deeply at Fielding in front of him. At this moment, Fielding was looking at Manninger at the same level and did not back down. "Since the patriarch has entrusted me with this matter, I do not dare to slack off in the slightest. Please tell me the details of this matter." Manninger finally nodded and lowered his voice. There is not much food left in the army. If the enemy's army intercepts us, we will not be able to fight for a long time, and we will lose without a doubt. If this matter really cannot be resolved, I will allow you to only take my elites and break out of the encirclement. Leave this camp behind and return to your country. Their Byzantine army will definitely focus their attention on annihilating our army. If you break out of the encirclement with a small group of elites, they will not pursue too much. After returning to your country, you will have an audience with His Majesty the Emperor God and tell him what happened to my Scarlet Snow army. After all, His Majesty the Emperor God and I still have some friendship. His Majesty's temperament has always been relying on the strong but not the weak. If I die in battle, he will definitely protect my people on account of our friendship. Supporting my second son to inherit the position of patriarch can also be considered as preserving my Bashark family. Hearing this, Fielding's face sank. His body could not help but sway. Manninger's words were clear and clear. He had allowed himself to abandon the entire army in times of crisis and only take Manninger's personal camp with him. At the most critical moment, Manninger still prioritized his own family after all. Even if he had to abandon the entire army, he would let his personal camp return to their country to support his second son to inherit the position of patriarch. The nature of a fierce and ruthless person was undoubtedly revealed. Seeing that Fielding's eyes were flickering, as if he had something else in mind to ask, Manninger had already shook his head. He looked at Fielding and sighed, "As for the rest, it's not something I can see now. Let's leave it to fate." Fielding did not dare to say anything more. With tears in his eyes, he slowly stood up and bowed solemnly again. He bowed heavily and gave a big bow. Then, he wiped away the tears at the corner of his eyes and turned to leave. After Fielding left, Manninger, who was in the carriage, finally closed his eyes and smiled bitterly. "I heard that the commander of this Byzantium army is that guy called Shea Thunder. When I went south, he came to see me alone and tricked me. I only thought that he was a brave young talent, but I didn't expect him to be so amazing. The Byzantine Empire is full of heroes, but I, Odin, only care about brute force. Fate, everything is fate. I, Manninger, came south, swallowed Silton, occupied Corsica, and destroyed the 7th Division. My life's fame was not in vain. I, Odin, have lived a heroic life. Even if I die, I will leave behind an illustrious name. A great man will not have walked this world in vain." He suddenly opened his eyes again. "Come, help me up." The personal guards on his left and right had tears in their eyes. When they heard Manninger's call, 2 of them naturally came over and helped the patriarch up. Manninger could no longer walk, so he could only stand on the carriage and look into the distance. At this moment, his eyes were not looking at the blazing new city in the distance. Instead, he looked to the left and then to the right. His eyes were full of lingering and unwillingness. On the plains, the terrain was flat and the land was vast. "It's a pity, a pity. This piece of land does not belong to us after all." As he sighed, Manninger's mutterings gradually grew weaker and weaker until they finally subsided. His proud head finally tilted to the side slowly. At night, the hero of the Odin Empire, the patriarch of the Bashak tribe, the commander of the Scarlet Snow Army, Manninger, finally passed away with hatred. If you want to know what happens next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 473. This chapter is too long. I wrote more than 11,000 words, so it's a little late, Chapter 434. Mourning soldiers cannot be easily humiliated outside the new city. The Scarlet Snow Army's camp did not make any movements for 2 consecutive days. The army was just outside the new city. On the first day they attacked for a while, but they did not expect that on the second day they would cease all activity. It was so strange that it made the defenders on the city feel uneasy. Manning of the Scarlet Snow Army was famous for his fighting prowess. Ever since he came down south, he had annihilated the 7th Division and wiped out the Corsica military region. The Scarlet Snow Army's reputation for being good at fighting and Manning's deep foresight were naturally deeply rooted in the hearts of these defenders. Odin's men suddenly stopped attacking the city. Could it be that Manning was secretly plotting something? The fire in the city burned for a day and night before it was finally extinguished. The fire in the city looked like it was boiling from the outside, but in fact, the city's control of the fire was extremely tight. In order to control the fire, Nene had already ordered the surrounding streets to be cleared. Hundreds of people were organized around the dozens of wells around the fire to be on standby. After all, the new city was a big city, and it was an area with rich land like Ilton County. Traditionally, grain-producing areas had a characteristic: rich water resources. There were many rivers around the new city, and the underground water was also abundant. There were no less than 100 deep and shallow wells in the city, and there were also canals, open canals, and underground canals. In addition, it was winter and it had just snowed, so it was very humid. Therefore, Nene was confident in setting the fire. He was not afraid that the fire would spread and burn the entire city. Originally, he set the fire to scare the enemy. If the fire accidentally spread and burned himself, that would be the biggest joke. This method of setting the fire to scare the enemy was secretly instructed by Shea to Nene before he left the city. That day, before Shea led the army out of the city, he had whispered to Nene about this matter. The supplies and provisions in the new city were Manning's lifeblood. If they were to burn it, it would break Manning's foundation. The Scarlet Snow Army's morale would definitely plummet. Although it would be a pity to burn these things that were piled up like a mountain, it must be known that Shea's life was not rich. His territory was small and his foundation was weak. Supporting more than 20,000 people was already very difficult. However, this fire had to be burned. Nene had also suggested that setting fire to a few empty houses might be able to confuse the people outside the city. Shea smiled. He didn't think that Nene's idea was whimsical, but in fact, for an old fox like Manning, this kind of small trick would be very difficult to hide from him. One had to know that there was a difference in the momentum of the smoke produced by burning something. Manning had fought in wars for half his life, so he could still see the difference. Not to mention Manning, even some of the experienced old scouts in the army could see the difference. It was just like how Manning had seen through the smoke in Green's army. If Manning saw that he was pretending to set the fire, he was afraid that not only would it not achieve the effect of attacking his heart, but it would also increase Manning's morale. If these supplies and provisions were to be burned, then so be it. However, Nei was still a woman after all. Before setting the fire, he still asked people to move out a small portion of the food as a reserve. When the fire was set, the Scarlet Snow Army outside the city suddenly stopped moving. For 2 whole days, they holed up in the camp outside the city. Not only did they not attack the city, they didn't even pretend to attack or harass. According to common sense, the attacking party, even if they didn't intend to attack immediately, they would at least send people to shout or make a ruckus under the city to disturb the morale of the defending army. However, for these 2 days, there was no sign of Odin under the city. Both parties looked at each other from afar, and there was actually a sense of peace. Although Nei wasn't an old general in the army, he at least understood some common sense. The way the Scarlet Snow Army acted was too strange. It was as if they were looking for trouble for themselves. This time, the Scarlet Snow Army came out in full force to fight Grim. It had been a long time since they sent out the troop. All this time, the army's supplies were exhausted and they relied on the continuous transportation of supplies from the new city. However, after the new city was attacked, it took 7 days to return to the army. When they reached the new city, they stopped for another 2 days. Logically, the Scarlet Snow Army's supplies were almost depleted. When the army went to war, food was the most important thing. The Scarlet Snow Army had tens of thousands of people, so they consumed tens of thousands of kilograms of food every day. 10 days would be hundreds of thousands of kilograms. In the past, when the army went to war, it was naturally impossible to bring all the food in the army at once. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a war, and the soldiers would run to transport the food. Historically, the food reserves in the army were calculated in half a month. They would carry half a month's worth of food as a reserve, and then transport from the rear would replenish it continuously. Otherwise, if a war had to be fought for a few months, it was impossible to bring all the food that tens of thousands of soldiers consumed for a few months with them. The Scarlet Snow Army had lost their base in the new city, so their supply line was naturally cut off. They had to run all the way back. The time on the road, plus the time under the city, and counting the days, they were afraid that the food in the army was really running out. The problem was, Nei also understood Shea's idea. Openly setting fire to the reserves in the city would definitely cause the Scarlet Snow Army's morale to be in chaos. Who wouldn't panic when the food was gone? But now, the silence was too strange. Nei thought about it herself. If she was in Manningham's position, there were only 2 choices. One was to simply fight, attack the city, and slaughter the enemy. Although the food was burned, at least she had to vent the anger in her heart. 2 was to immediately retreat and look for another place to eat. But for these 2 options, no matter which one she chose, she had to be fast. Wasting time and not moving was the biggest taboo for a military strategist. What the hell was the Scarlet Snow Army outside the city doing? The Scarlet Snow Army really didn't do anything. Even though Shea had planned it first, even though Nei wasn't stupid, who would have thought that the backbone of the Scarlet Snow Army, the core leader, His Excellency Manningham, would actually die at this critical moment? As the chief and commander-in-chief, Meningo must have a great deal of authority, and his words were the law in the tribe. But the result was, once he was suddenly gone, the position of the chief was empty, and suddenly there was no leader. Although there were many other chief generals and elders in the army, none of them had the prestige to suppress everyone. If Morka was in the army, he might be able to use his identity as the legitimate heir to force everyone to listen to his orders. But the problem was, Morka was already killed by Shea in the Battle of the New City. The commander was dead, and so was the heir. Before Manningham died, he entrusted Fielding to take charge of the overall situation. But, after his death, the situation changed. Manningham was decisive when he was alive. As the chief, no one dared to go against His Majesty. But the problem was that Manningham also had a problem when he was alive. He was too dictatorial. He had all the power in his hands, but he didn't cultivate any capable deputies. Perhaps this was deliberately done by Manningham to maintain his rule, but now it had become the biggest fatal flaw of the Scarlet Snow Army. Fielding naturally unified Manningham's personal battalion. Manningham's personal battalion was also the strongest among the various battalions of the Scarlet Snow Army. They were all elite warriors of the tribe. But the standard Odin army, like the Scarlet Snow Army, had always had a rough internal military system. It was not as well regulated as the Byzantine army. An army was often the epitome of a tribe. Every time there was a war, the chief would go up and shout, and the tribes below would mobilize their young warriors to form an army. There was no strict military system. This kind of army was actually more of a joint army. There were tens of thousands of people in the Scarlet Snow Army, and they were all allied forces from the various tribes of the Bashak tribe. When Manningham was alive, he was the chief. In addition, the strength of his personal battalion was the strongest in the army. Naturally, he could subdue the entire army. His orders and prohibitions were obeyed, and his words were obeyed. But once he died, there were many people who jumped out. The Bashak tribe was one of the 5 major tribes of Odin. Such a large tribe had a history of repeated mergers and acquisitions over the years of development. The big tribes ate the small tribes to expand and become stronger. In this kind of barbaric country there was no law to speak of. After the big tribes attacked the small tribes and annexed them, the small tribes merged into the big tribes. Their names were changed, and they became the Bashak tribe. After Manningham's death, although Fielding was an elder in the tribe, and he was also a pure-blooded member of the true Bashak tribe, and not from other tribes that were annexed from outside, his prestige was not enough. Although Manningham handed over the personal battalion to him, the problem was, after this battle, Manningham's personal battalion suffered the most losses. The 2,000 elites who stayed behind to guard the new city, the personal battalion's elites, were all destroyed by Shea. The thousands of cavalrymen who gathered to attack the new city were also the personal battalion's elites, but they were also defeated. His Scarlet Snow Army was said to be tens of thousands, but in fact, Manningham's personal battalion only accounted for less than half of them. At most, there were 15,000 people from the tribe. The continuous losses had already affected the vitality of the tribe. Especially the elite cavalrymen, they were all wiped out. In addition, there was another situation. In the Scarlet Snow Army, there were only 5,000 to 6,000 personal battalion soldiers in the camp at the moment. The entire army originally had 15,000 personal battalion soldiers. In fact, before this battle, Manningham had dismissed a group of them and arranged them to be stationed in various places in Ilton County. This was originally just a way for Manningham to control his subordinate. His personal battalion had no qualms about loyalty, so naturally, they could be stationed outside at ease. As for those people who were not from the tribe, they were under his eyelids. With him personally watching over them, he could be at ease. But the problem was that was when Manningham was alive. When Meningo was still alive, even if he was alone and led the men of the other tribes, with the pressure of his prestige, no one dared to disobey any of his orders, let alone whether he had a large number of his own warriors by his side. Therefore, for this expedition, Manningham only brought more than 8,000 personal battalion soldiers with him. As for the other personal battalion elites, he left more than 2,000 to Morka in the new city and arranged them to be scattered all over Ilton County. Some were stationed in hundreds and some were stationed in thousands. Being stationed in various places, far away from the main camp, was the attitude of a local tyrant. There were more benefits, and it was also some of the benefits that Manningham deliberately gave to his personal battalion soldiers. But now the situation was different. Of the more than 8,000 personal battalion soldiers in the army, after a few thousand cavalrymen were annihilated, there were only 5,000 to 6,000 people left. As for the other tribes' camps, there were almost no losses. Their strength decreased and increased, plus Manningham and Morka, the father and son pair, were dead. Without the suppression from above, it was hard to tell what the people below were thinking. Fielding commanded the personal battalion according to Manningham's dying order. Originally, the day after Manningham's death, he was to order the whole army to return north. But after the order was issued, what annoyed Fielding was that this order could not be carried out. Some of the leaders of the other tribes even openly disobeyed the order. In the Scarlet Snow Army, in terms of status, each battalion represented the power of one of the tribes. The leaders of each tribe also had the status of an elder in the tribe. In terms of status, they were completely on par with Fielding. Fielding did not have much prestige in the past, and now his command was somewhat different from the other tribes below. These 2 days, the Scarlet Snow Army did not move, but in the commander-in-chief's big tent, there was already an uproar. Among the leaders of the various tribes, some were of the Bashark's tribe, and some were from other small tribes that had been annexed in the past. At this moment, they all had their own thoughts. Fielding conveyed Manningham's dying order to retreat, but on the spot, more than half of the leaders expressed their open opposition. These people's reasons were also different. Some demanded to immediately take down the new city, and the reason seemed to be sufficient, to avenge clan leader Manningham and Morka. Some thought that returning north was too stupid. They still had tens of thousands of warriors here. The world was so big, where could they not go? Ilton County was already a piece of juicy meat in their mouths. How could they just spit it out? Even if there was insufficient food, they could go to other places to eat, plunder food, and reorganize the army. This Ilton County was still ours. Some thought that they should immediately turn back and go to Grimm's army again to boost their morale with the momentum of victory. In short, no matter what was said, they all thought that returning north to return home was simply an absurd order. Although everyone was still afraid of Manningham's remaining power in the past and did not dare to publicly rebuke this dying order, some people were bold enough to say that the clan leader's mind was not clear when he died, so he gave such an absurd order. We can't be muddle-headed. Since we know that this order is absurd, we shouldn't carry it out. There were also some who were hot-tempered but had hidden ambitions. They simply rolled up their sleeves and openly shouted, "Although the clan leader is dead, I'm still here." Such a scene caused Fielding to have a headache, and he was secretly shocked. Putting aside whether the opinions of these tribal leaders were right or wrong, just looking at the chaotic scene in front of him, Fielding could at least be sure that clan leader Manningham's dying order to immediately return north was correct. In an army, there were more than a dozen different voices. There was no strong commander at the top, and more than a dozen battalions below were not willing to submit to each other. How could they fight a war like this? Seeing that the clan leader had died, these guys came out one by one. Some even began to openly covet the position of commander. They had even quarreled with each other for the past 2 days. Odin's people had always been rough and hot-tempered. Some of them almost pulled out their swords and started a fight on the spot. In such a situation, before the Byzantium people could make a move, the people here would be fighting among themselves if they stayed here for a few more days. Split into pieces. Truly split into pieces. With such an army, how could they continue to stay in Ilton County and continue to fight? If they did not return home as soon as possible, they might really be wiped out here. When all was said and done, Fielding was simply not a talented commander. Manningham was too domineering when he was alive, and did not cultivate any assistance. As a leader, he was too domineering. His trusted subordinates and direct subordinates had also developed a habit of being subservient to him. Manningham valued Fielding and came to him because Fielding had a rather steady and cautious temperament. He was better than the other Odin's people. Another reason was that before Manningham died, he could not find a better candidate in his haste. He had no choice but to choose Fielding. Fielding was a cautious person, but he did not have enough courage. He could not subdue the crowd, but he did not have a good solution either. He could only drag it out for 2 days. He had originally planned to try his best to persuade the other leaders, but his efforts were all wasted. Some people even saw him as weak and despised him in their hearts. All along, the people of Odin respected the most were the heroic men with soaring heroism. The people of Odin did not look up to this kind of subservient and steady person. Furthermore, when they saw that the kinsman's battalion was weak and their leader, Fielding, was not a man of his own, they even had the idea of swallowing the kinsman's battalion. After waiting for 2 days, Fielding finally ran out of patience after the endless clamor in the tent. Although he was not a great talent, his steady temperament was real. Seeing these ambitious fellows appear anxiously after the death of their patriarch, quarreling every day, wanting to take over the position of commander-in-chief, they could not suppress each other, and there were faint signs of internal strife. Who would really care about the patriarch's last words? They quarreled every day, drew their swords and fought with their fists. But who would really care about the situation in the army? Although Fielding was anxious, he still paid attention to the situation in the army every time. The food consumption was about to be depleted, and he kept such things in his heart. However, these fellows were blinded by the position of the patriarch, and their eyes were red. These idiots! Did they think that they could reach the sky in one step after snatching the position of the Scarlet Snow Army's commander-in-chief? Since these fellows are looking for death, I, Fielding, will not accompany them. At this moment, Fielding was sitting in the big tent. The commander-in-chief's seat was empty, and he was sitting on the lower left side of the commander-in-chief's seat. He looked at the shouting and scolding in the big tent, and there were even a few hot-tempered fellows who had rolled up their sleeves and pulled out their swords, ready to fight. Enough! Fielding suddenly let out a furious roar. His roar was full of vigor. With a swoosh, Fielding had already pulled out his sword and slashed the table in front of him fiercely, jumping up. He had always been an honest and calm person, but when an honest person was angry, he was naturally quite powerful. With Fielding's sudden outburst, the noisy tent instantly quieted down. Everyone was looking at this cowardly guy with a strange look. Fielding's roar shocked everyone, but it was only a matter of a moment. After calming down, who would be afraid of him? Fielding, what are you shouting for? Humph, you even pulled out your sword. Are you trying to take the lead? Lao Tzu is not afraid of you. Fielding, you really think of yourself as the commander-in-chief. If you want to give orders here, wait until you become the patriarch. You still dare to pull out your sword. If you have the guts, you can slash Lao Tzu with your sword. I'm standing right here. If you even frown, you're not a man of Odin. Fielding looked at the cold eyes and taunts around him, and waited for these people to finish speaking before he took a deep breath. With a sullen face, he said coldly, I, Fielding, am naturally not the patriarch. Do you all think of yourselves as the patriarch? Since Master Meningo is not here, then the patriarch's second son will naturally take over. It's not up to me to give orders, so naturally, it's not up to you. These two sentences, however, were not something that anyone dared to refute publicly. According to convention, the position of the patriarch should naturally be taken over by Meningo's son. But everyone was ambitious. At this moment, Meningo and Morka were dead, and the pro-camp was greatly weakened. Meningo's second son, who was left in the domestic tribe, was still young and did not have much prestige. This was the time for the young master. The elites of the Scarlet Snow Army were all here. If someone controlled the entire army now, then the position of the patriarch, was really hard to say. However, although everyone had such thoughts in their hearts, it wasn't appropriate for them to say it out loud. Therefore, when Fielding said these words, no one dared to refute him publicly. At most, they just snorted coldly. I know that you all don't want to return to your country. Fielding smiled coldly. I won't fight with you idiots anymore. If you all want to be the commander and fight for this command, it's up to you. I, Fielding, will not accompany you. Originally, when he said, idiots, some people glared and were about to get angry. However, when they heard that Fielding actually took the initiative to give up the fight, they instantly lost the thought of getting angry. In this competition, it was naturally a good thing if there was one less opponent. Although everyone looked down on Fielding, after all, he still had 5,000 to 6,000 elite pro-camp in his hand. These people looked at each other. Suddenly, someone could not help but say, Fielding, what do you want? What do I want? Fielding said loudly, you all don't follow the patriarch's will, but I will. You all can fight here, I'll bring people back to my country. I won't participate in your fight. When this was said, everyone's expression was different. Some people's faces showed some shame, some were secretly relieved, and some were puzzled. However, no one objected. After all, he, Fielding, could be considered a powerful force. Since he had made it clear that he would not participate in the fight, if he left, then so be it. At the very least, it would make them feel at ease. Seeing that no one was speaking, Fielding took a deep breath and said, "I will lead the pro-camp and escort the patriarch's remains back to his country for burial. I won't bother with your dispute. However, you all are not allowed to interfere with me. Otherwise, if you disturb the patriarch's remains, even if I have to bleed to death, I will fight that person to the death." After saying that, Fielding glared and shouted. The others were silent for a moment. Then, someone said, "Fine. Fielding, we also don't dare to disturb the patriarch's rest. You bring people back to your country. We won't interfere with you, so don't interfere with us." Fielding nodded and said with a gloomy face, "I only have one request. If you satisfy me, I will bring people back this afternoon. If you don't, humph, everyone will fight to the death." His words caused the atmosphere to tense up again. Immediately, someone shouted, "Fielding, who do you think you are? How dare you threaten me?" There were also some who were more quick-witted. "Fielding, tell us, what are your conditions?" "I want rations," Fielding said coolly. "I want half of the rations in the army. I am going north to return to my country. Along the way, I will have to pass through Moore County and escort the patriarch's remains. For such a big matter, the warriors of my pro-camp cannot travel on empty stomachs." This request caused everyone to fall silent. Fielding continued coldly, "I will only take half of the rations. You all stay here. Whether you continue to attack the new city or go somewhere else to reorganize your troops is up to you. Ilton County is a big place. Naturally, you all have other ways to gather rations. With this little amount of rations, you want me to leave this place. Whether or not this deal is worth it, you all can decide for yourselves." After saying that, Fielding held his head high and his chest puffed out. Holding the blade in his hand, he walked out of the big tent. When he reached the door, he suddenly stopped. He turned around and said coldly, "I will go back and gather my men. As for the rations in the army, I will move them myself. If no one objects, I will take the rations and leave. If anyone tries to stop me, let's fight it out. I, Fielding, am also a man of the Odin. I still have the courage to fight to the death." As soon as he finished speaking, he left without looking back. Fielding finally showed a look of determination. When he returned, he immediately ordered his men to gather, pack up and send someone to collect the rations. There was not much rations left in the army. He thought that someone would object when he wanted to take half of the rations with him. However, when it came down to it, everything went smoothly. Not a single tribe stepped forward to stop him. Fielding's mind turned slightly and he understood what these people meant. Firstly, although these fellows were making a lot of noise, no one dared to start a fight with him. After all, he still had 5,000 to 6,000 strong pro-camp warriors. If they really started a fight, it would be hard to say who would win. At the moment, everyone wanted to fight for the position of the leader. However, the more it was so, the more they did not dare to damage their own strength. Whoever really dared to fight with him would naturally suffer a great loss of vitality. Without strength, they would be the first to be eliminated. Secondly, in the eyes of these idiots, it might be worth it to use such a small amount of rations in exchange for a strong competitor like him to take the initiative to be eliminated. These idiots, after 2 more days, they would understand how precious such a small amount of rations was. Fielding's movements were extremely fast. In the afternoon, he had already gathered his men and brought the rations. The entire army of more than 5,000 people left the camp and headed north. Manninger's body had already been cremated. His bones were placed in a jar and placed in the horse carriage that he had ridden in when he was alive. The pro-camp was made up of the elites of the tribe. They were the most loyal and devoted to Manninger. They carried out the orders of the tribe leader without any hesitation. After Manninger's death, the entire army had already made preparations to head north. After waiting for 2 more days, they had already become impatient. Therefore, once Fielding had made up his mind, the preparations had already been made. He left as soon as he said so. Thousands of pro-camp warriors headed north. With Fielding in command, the speed of the army's march was not slow. However, the entire army had only traveled a short distance to the north, and before the sky had even turned dark, they were stopped. The terrain of Ilton County was flat. The new city was surrounded by plains. When the army traveled, the surroundings were flat and there was no danger of an ambush. It wasn't even evening yet, but the sound of hooves could be heard from afar. Looking from afar, snow and dust could be seen flying in the air. A group of cavalrymen was charging towards them at lightning speed. They came from the left side of the formation, and cut off the path to the north from afar. Thousands of scarlet snow soldiers were immediately on alert. The cavalry that came was not large in number. Looking from afar, there were only a few hundred of them. At the very most, there would not be more than 1,000 of them. However, on the plains, there were no fortifications or obstructions. Even if the enemy only had a few hundred cavalry, it was enough to pose a threat to thousands of infantry. The cavalry was not in a hurry to attack. They only blocked the front and stared at the thousands of men from afar. Fielding had led the army for less than half a day, and they were stopped. He was shocked. He thought to himself that the Patriarch's plan was right. These Byzantium people were indeed plotting something. Fielding took a deep breath. A few thoughts flashed through his mind. He turned to the warriors behind him and shouted, "There's an enemy blocking the way ahead. I know that our journey back home this time is full of danger. However, we are all indebted to the Patriarch. Now we have to protect the Patriarch's remains. Even if we have to kill to the last man, we must not let these Byzantium people disturb the Patriarch's remains." What a wonderful way to put it! The morale of the pro-camp was already low. If Fielding said anything else to boost their morale, it would most likely not be of much use. However, using the reason of protecting the remains of the Patriarch, the morale of the entire army was immediately lifted. Meningo was the most generous to his pro-camp when he was alive. He gave the elites of his tribe the best equipment and the most generous rewards. In addition to his prestige, this Patriarch was like a god in the hearts of these pro-camp soldiers. Now that the Patriarch was dead, the morale of the army was slack. It was impossible to boost their morale now. However, the words, "protecting the Patriarch's remains," ignited the bloodlust in the hearts of these Odin elites. Their morale was instantly boosted. Some Odin soldiers shouted, "If we die, so be it. If we let these filthy Byzantium sheep disturb the Patriarch's remains, even if we return alive, we won't have the face to see our families. Odin is a man, how can we let these Byzantium people humiliate us like this? We pledge our lives to protect the Patriarch." Seeing that the morale was boosted, Fielding heaved a sigh of relief. He immediately ordered the army to be on guard, while he rode on his deer, and slowly got into formation. He, Fielding, had never been known for his bravery. However, at this moment, he rode out alone. The soldiers behind him looked at him with more respect. After Fielding slowly took a few steps forward, he shouted, "Your troops in front. Commander, please come out for a talk." His voice was full of energy, without the slightest fear. The cavalry blocking the road was naturally Shea's troops. Shea looked at the thousands of Odin troops opposite him and was also puzzled. Seeing the other party riding out slowly and loudly asking for him to come out for a talk, he smiled in his heart. A few days ago, when he annihilated the Odin cavalry, he played such a trick, tricking the commander of the Odin cavalry to come out, and then suddenly killing him, causing the Odin people to be leaderless. Could it be that the commander of the Odin army in front of him also wanted to play such a trick? However, when had he, Master Shea, ever been afraid of this? With a proud smile, he slowly urged his horse out. He left the group alone and ran for dozens of steps. He had even entered the range of the enemy's arrows. Shea proudly shouted in the Odin language with a heroic look on his face. I am the commander! The Odin barbarians opposite us, what do you want to talk to Lao Tzu about? If you want to surrender, hurry up, don't waste time. Fielding looked at Shea from afar and took a deep breath. May I know your name? Shea Thunder. A voice full of arrogance. Fielding's heart skipped a beat. This name seems to belong to the commander of the Byzantine army. Could it be that the person in front of me is? Fielding pondered for a moment and shouted in a deep voice. So it's Sir Shea. I have something to say, do you dare to listen? As he spoke, he pointed to a direction in the distance. Do you dare to talk face to face? Fielding himself slowly headed in that direction first. Shea was surprised, thinking, is this guy's brain damaged? Or does he want to have a duel with my commander? He was not the kind of person who would act according to common sense. His first thought was, who cares what you are up to? Your commander has left the group, and Lao Tzu will take the opportunity to kill him. However, after taking a closer look, the thousands of Odin's soldiers opposite him were on high alert and emitting a murderous aura. This kind of aura made Shea somewhat uncertain in his heart. These Odin soldiers actually have such an aura? This was strange. Shea was very courageous. He smiled coldly and rode forward. The two main generals gathered together in the middle of the battlefield. Sir Shea. Fielding looked at the young general in front of him. Seeing that Shea's body was no longer majestic and was full of heroic spirit, Fielding sighed in his heart. Sure enough, he looked like a hero. Shea's expression was cold. Sir, you asked me to speak. Do you want to issue a letter of challenge, or do you want to fight before the battle? Fielding muttered to himself for a moment, then suddenly raised his hand and saluted Shea. Shea was stunned by this action. I have heard of your name. Seeing you today, you are indeed a heroic man. I am Fielding, the deputy of Lord Manninger, the Bashark Patriarch. At this moment, all of my troops are here to escort Lord Manninger's remains north to return to the country. May I be so bold as to ask Sir Shea to step aside and allow us to escort the Patriarch's remains back to the country? Although your side and my side have different standpoints, with Sir Shea's heroic spirit, you won't even kill your opponent's remains. If your excellency is willing to step aside, my Bashark clan will definitely remember today's matter in the future. These few words were already a public show of weakness, but after these few soft words, Fielding's face suddenly changed, becoming sinister and ferocious. He gritted his teeth and said word by word, If your excellency is not willing, you must not even let my patriarch's remains go. The thousands of elites in my personal camp have received the patriarch's kindness. They will definitely protect the patriarch's remains and fight to the death until the last person is left. Shea was completely stunned. He was not stunned by Fielding's request, nor was it Fielding's show of weakness. Rather Manninger. He is actually dead? This old man is actually dead? This news hit Shea's heart like a heavy hammer. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind in an instant. His first reaction was, could this be one of Manninger's schemes? To lure me into a trap? But upon closer inspection, although Fielding's face was cold, there was a trace of grief between his brows that could not be hidden. In the distance, the thousands of Odin troops were on high alert. Their murderous aura soared to the sky, but there was also a faint trace of grief. If it was just one person, perhaps his acting skills were good enough to deceive him. However, the sorrowful aura of these thousands of people could not be faked. Manninger is really dead? In front of the two armies, the two commanders gathered together and whispered to each other. The distance was so far that the soldiers on both sides could not hear the content of their conversation. After Shea and Fielding talked for a while, the two of them suddenly got up from their mounts and slapped each other's hands. Fielding coldly pulled out his knife and pierced his palm, then slapped it on his chest. Shea cut his thumb and smeared a trace of blood on his forehead. This was clearly an oath made by the people of Odin and the people of Byzantium. He didn't know what kind of strange agreement the two main generals of both sides had made. Shea and Fielding both turned back to their troop. As for Shea, the cavalry suddenly whistled and slowly moved to the side of the road. They ran far away and opened up the road. They even took the initiative to retreat to a position an arrow's distance away. On Fielding's side, the army slowly moved north on the road. Along the way they were on high alert. Under the watchful eyes of Shea's hundreds of cavalry, they slowly moved forward. Shea's order puzzled the elite cavalry soldiers beside him. The cavalry soldiers stopped by the side of the road and did not move. Someone could not help but speak up. "My lord, Shea suddenly smiled. "I have good news. Manninger is dead." The moment he said that, everyone's faces changed. Then, the hundreds of cavalry soldiers became excited. Shea pointed at the Odin's men who were moving further away on the road. "At this moment, Manninger's remains are with this army. They are escorting Manninger's remains north to return home, My lord, why don't we take advantage of this opportunity to kill them? They are like a group of dragons without a leader. We can take down this Odin's army in one go." "That's right. Although they have a lot of people, they are all infantry. A few days ago, several thousand cavalry soldiers were defeated by us. What more these few thousand infantry soldiers?" "My lord, you lead us to kill them." The surrounding people became excited. Shea, however, turned his head and said with a solemn face, "All of you, shut up." Shea frowned and pointed to the distance. He said coldly, "Although they only have a few thousand men, look carefully. They are on high alert and the entire army is silent. No one is moving. Look at the eyes of these Odin's men. Where is the slightest bit of panic? Indifference, hatred, and murderous intent. These guys are different from the Odin's men that we encountered before. They are all determined to die and have the will to die in their hearts. Fighting with such opponents, wasting our strength in vain is unwise." Actually, didn't Shea want to take down these few thousand men? Of course he did. He wasn't so benevolent as to let Manninger's remains return home. Heroes should respect heroes and appreciate each other. This country bumpkin didn't have such thoughts at this moment. In his heart, invaders were invaders. Blood for blood, a tooth for a tooth, that was the right thing to do. But he wasn't reckless. If they really fought, he was confident that he could defeat this Odin's army. But the enemy's morale was so astonishing. It could be imagined that a cornered beast would fight with its worries. The enemy had the determination to die, so when they fought, such an enemy would definitely erupt with astonishing fighting power. Even if they won, he would probably suffer a lot of losses. At this moment, he knew that Manninger was already dead. How could Shea be willing to waste his strength here? Plus, the content of the conversation between Fielding and himself just now, Interesting. With Manninger dead, this Scarlet Snow army seemed to have internal strife. Good. Very good. Although Fielding didn't say it explicitly, Shea understood the few hints in his words. Shea didn't doubt the truth of Fielding's words. He believed it, because the reason Fielding hinted was very clear. He, Fielding, had brought these pro-battalion troops back home to support the young master to inherit the position of the chief. And the Scarlet Snow army had already rebelled. They didn't listen to the chief's last words. Those guys were ambitious. To the Bashak tribe, these people were traitors. Since they were traitors, Fielding simply abandoned them. In Fielding's opinion, these people would die if they stayed here. Dying in Shea's hands could be considered as eliminating the traitors for the tribe. Secondly, it could also attract Shea's forces so that he could cross the border calmly. Everyone had their own ideas. In fact, after seeing the true colors of the leaders of the various camps, Fielding was actually unwilling to bring these people back to the country. These people had already exposed their ambitions. After returning home to the tribe, they would have soldiers and courage in their hands. But at this moment, the elites of the tribe had suffered many casualties, and the young master was still young. It might be dangerous. These guys, it would be better if they all died outside. Just now, both of them had made a blood oath. It was an agreement that Fielding would tell him the entire situation of the Scarlet Snow Army, and Shea promised that he would never stop Fielding's thousands of people along the way to return to the north. Shea even said that he could send a small troop of cavalry to escort them along the way. Even if they reached Moore County, he could guarantee that there would be no guards to stop them and they would be able to cross the border safely. In the current situation, instead of risking the loss of troops to fight to the death with the elites of the Scarlet Snow Army, it was better to save their strength to take down the Scarlet Snow Army. The big picture was more important. These were just a few thousand people. It really didn't matter whether they could take them down or not. It wasn't that Shea didn't have other thoughts, but he really didn't have enough troops in his hands. If he also had a few thousand elite soldiers in his hands, he wouldn't have wasted time to make a blood oath with Fielding. He would have gone up and killed the other party directly. But now, Shea didn't have enough troops in his hands after all. This time, to be able to get the situation to where it was now, he had already taken a lot of risks and done his best. Looking at Odin's troop heading north from afar, Shea sighed softly. A mourning soldier can't be humiliated easily. Forget it. Yesterday's promise has been fulfilled, 11,000 words. I don't ask for any votes, but please don't vote for more than 10,000. I can't eat it, so I'm very depressed. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support legal reading. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.